She pressed herself into the corner of the bedroom, knees pulled to her chest, fingers clawing the wallpaper, and whispered the only word she had left. Please. Not a greeting, not a welcome, not anything a bride was supposed to say on her wedding night. Nathan Cole stood in the doorway of his own cabin, a man who had broken wild horses with his bare hands, a man the whole valley called dangerous, and he did not move a single step closer. He just looked at her, and something in his chest cracked open, like dry timber. If this story already has you feeling something deep in your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, because this journey is only just beginning. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. She had been on the stagecoach for 11 days. 11 days of rattling wheels and dust so thick it coated the back of her throat. 11 days of watching the world outside the window change from green flatlands to rocky slopes to the kind of mountains that made a person feel very small and very alone. Elizabeth Carter sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on nothing, and she told herself the same thing she had been telling herself since she stepped onto that coach in St. Louis. You made a choice. Now you live with it. She was 22 years old. She had $43, a single traveling trunk, and a letter she had read so many times the fold lines were splitting. The letter was from a man named Nathan Cole of Black Pine Ridge, Montana, and it said exactly the things a practical man said when he needed a wife and had no patience for pretense. He could offer her a home. He could offer her safety. He ran cattle on 300 acres in the mountains, and he needed someone who could manage a household and keep accounts. He was not looking for romance. He did not promise love. Elizabeth had written back and said she was not looking for romance either. That had been 4 months ago. Now the coach was slowing, and the driver was calling out the name of a town so small it did not appear on any map she had consulted, and Elizabeth picked up her traveling bag and reminded herself to breathe. The town of Harrow Creek had one main street, 2 saloons, a general store, a church that looked like it was losing its argument with gravity, and approximately 30 people who had apparently found nothing better to do that afternoon than watch a stagecoach arrive. Elizabeth stepped down from the coach and straightened her coat and met the stares of 30 strangers with the expression she had perfected over the last 2 years. The one that showed nothing, gave away nothing, asked for nothing. A woman near the front of the crowd leaned toward her neighbor and said something behind her hand. The neighbor glanced at Elizabeth and shook her head slowly, the way people shook their heads at something they considered very sad or very foolish. Elizabeth had been the subject of that expression before. She kept her chin level. Miss Carter. The voice came from a man standing apart from the crowd near a wagon with 2 brown horses. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older somehow, weathered in a gentle way maybe, a man who looked tired but kind. Nathan Cole was tall in a way that altered the geometry of the space around him. His shoulders were broad under a dark canvas coat. His jaw was set hard, and the lines on his face were the kind that came not from smiling, but from years of wind and cold. And whatever it was that had put that particular look behind his eyes, a look that was not hostile exactly, but was not open either. He was 38, she knew that from the letters. He looked like a man who had lived those 38 years in weather. He did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He looked at her the way a man looks at a contract he is about to sign and is not entirely certain about. Yes, Elizabeth said. I'm Elizabeth Carter. Nathan Cole. He reached out and picked up her trunk from the luggage pile before she could say anything about it. Wagon's here. It's a 2-hour ride up the mountain. That was all he said. He carried her trunk to the wagon and secured it in the bed and climbed up to the driver's seat and waited. Elizabeth became aware in the silence that followed that the 30 people on the street were still watching. She heard someone say his name, Nathan Cole, in a tone that carried warning in it. She heard a woman say that poor girl doesn't know what she's riding into. She heard a man near the saloon door say something about the winter 3 years past, and a name she didn't recognize, and then laugh in the humorless way people laugh at tragedies they consider settled. Elizabeth walked to the wagon and climbed up to the seat beside Nathan Cole. He clicked his tongue at the horses and they moved. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The road climbed into the mountains, and the pines closed in on both sides, and the air turned colder, and Elizabeth looked at her hands in her lap and tried to order her thoughts into something manageable. She had made this choice with clear eyes. She had written those letters with a steady hand. She was not the kind of woman who fell apart because a situation was difficult. But her heart was doing something she did not have full authority over. "The people in town," she said finally. "They were talking about you." Nathan did not look at her. "They usually are." "They didn't seem—" She stopped, started again. "They seemed concerned about me coming up here." "I expect they did." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I think we ought to be honest with each other. I read your letters carefully, and I believe I understand the arrangement we've agreed to, but I'd rather know now directly from you if there's something I should be aware of." He turned his head and looked at her for a moment. His eyes were dark and steady and entirely unreadable. "There's a story they tell about me in Harrow Creek," he said. "About my wife and my brother, about the winter storm 3 years ago." He looked back at the road. "I'm not going to tell you that story tonight. You'll hear it from someone probably sooner than I'd like. When you do, I'd ask you to hold off on deciding what to make of it until you've had some time up here." Elizabeth studied his profile. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." She turned back to the road. The mountains were enormous above them, pale and blue in the late afternoon light, and the silence between them was not exactly comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had agreed to something they were not yet certain of. "I want to be honest with you as well," Elizabeth said. Her voice was level. She had practiced this. I am not in a position to be a full wife to you immediately. I need time to become comfortable. I understand that may not be what you expected, and I will understand if that changes the arrangement." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Carter," he said, "I wrote you 4 letters over 3 months. In those letters, I told you I needed someone to manage accounts and keep house, and that I wasn't looking for anything that had to be given before it was ready to be given." He paused. "I meant that." Elizabeth exhaled. She had not realized until that moment how much of her breath she had been holding since St. Louis. The cabin was larger than she expected, 2 rooms aloft, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. It was sparse, but it was clean, which told her something about the man. There was a kitchen with a proper iron stove and a table with 2 chairs and a shelf of books that surprised her. There was a bedroom through a door that he opened and showed her without ceremony. A bed, a dresser, a window looking out at the dark shapes of pines. "This is yours," Nathan said. "I'll be on the other side of the fire." Elizabeth looked at him. "The whole room," she said, "until you say otherwise." She did not know what to do with that. She had prepared arguments. She had prepared a careful negotiation about expectations and boundaries constructed over 11 days on a stagecoach. Assembled word by careful word because she knew she would need to say it, and she knew it would be difficult to say, and she had wanted to say it right. She had not prepared for him to simply preempt all of it with a flat statement of fact, as if the whole thing were obvious. "Thank you," she said. Nathan nodded once. "There's water on the stove. I'll see to the horses." He went outside. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of her bedroom for a moment in the quiet. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and breathed. She did not cry. She was finished with crying. But she sat there for a long time. She heard him come back in. She heard him moving in the main room, the soft thud of wood being added to the fire, the creak of his weight settling. Then silence. She lay down on the bed with her coat still on, and looked at the ceiling, and listened to the wind in the pines outside, and told herself she had done the right thing. Coming here, making this choice. She told herself it was going to be all right. She almost believed it. She woke in the dark from a dream she did not remember clearly, only the feeling of it, a weight pressing down. Hands she could not see, the sick, helpless knowledge that no one was coming. She sat up hard, gasping, and for 3 terrible seconds, she did not know where she was. Then she heard the fire, the soft crack and settle of it on the other side of the wall, and she remembered. Montana, Black Pine Ridge, Nathan Cole. She sat on the edge of the bed, with her hands pressed flat on her knees until her heart slowed. The cabin was quiet. Whoever was on the other side of that wall was sleeping or lying still enough that she could hear nothing of him. She got up quietly and went to the door and opened it a crack. He was on the floor beside the fire. Not on the settee, not in the chair on the floor with a bedroll and a blanket, his back to her, the firelight catching the dark of his hair. A man with 300 acres of mountain land sleeping on the floor of his own cabin, because a woman he had never met was afraid. Elizabeth stood in the doorway for a long time. In the morning, he was up before she was. She came out to find coffee on the stove and eggs in a pan, and Nathan standing at the kitchen window with his cup looking out at the mountain. He glanced at her when she came in, nodded once and went back to looking out the window. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. "You didn't have to sleep on the floor." "I know." The settee would have been more comfortable. Probably. Elizabeth poured herself coffee and sat down at the table. She looked at the backs of his shoulders and tried to figure out what she was dealing with. In her experience, men who did unexpectedly kind things usually had reasons for them that became apparent later, reasons that required something in return. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Nathan," he said without turning around. "Nathan." The name felt unfamiliar in her mouth. "I want to understand something. You've gone to a great deal of trouble on my account. The floor, the room. You didn't have to set any of that up in advance." He was quiet for a moment. "No." "So why did you?" He turned around then and looked at her across the table. His expression was the same as it had been the day before. Not cold exactly, but closed. Careful. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because I know what it costs a woman to make the kind of arrangement you made. To get on a coach and come to a stranger's house in the mountains." He paused. "You took a risk on me. Least I can do is not make you regret it on the first night." Elizabeth looked at him. "That's a very straightforward answer," she said. "I'm a straightforward man." She almost said the people in Harrow Creek don't seem to think so. She didn't. She drank her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the mountains in the early light and let the silence settle around them like something that was starting very tentatively to be all right. Over the days that followed, she learned his rhythms. He rose before dawn and worked through the morning on the ranch feeding cattle, mending fence, the 1,000 small tasks that kept 300 mountain acres from falling apart. He came in at midday and ate whatever she had put together, usually without comment, except to say it was good, and then he went back out. In the evenings, he came back in and sat with his book, or his accounts, and she sat with hers, and they did not talk much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people, learning the shape of each other without pressure. He did not touch her. Not accidentally, not deliberately, he seemed to have arranged his movements through the cabin, such that they were never close enough for any kind of contact. She noticed this. She did not know whether to be grateful or unsettled by such careful intentionality. She began keeping his accounts because he asked her to. He had known from the letters that she had worked as a bookkeeper for her father's business before it failed, and he told her flatly that his own records were a mess and he had more important things to spend his time on. She found that this was true. His ledgers were a disaster of crossed-out figures and incomplete entries and numbers that did not match across columns. She spent 3 evenings getting them in order and discovered in the process that he was managing the ranch on a thinner margin than she had imagined, and doing it with a competence that was quietly impressive. He knew his operation, he just did not know how to write it down. "You're missing a full season of feed costs," she told him one evening, pointing to a gap in the records. He looked up from his book. "I know." "And your lumber account doesn't reconcile." "I know that too." "You know, and you didn't fix it." "I didn't have time to fix it," he said. "That's why I needed someone who could." Elizabeth looked at him. "That's actually the most sensible thing you've said since I got here," Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but almost. She had not expected that. She looked back down at the ledger before he could see her reaction to it. On the 5th day, she heard him. Before she saw him, a sound from the direction of the barn, low and rhythmic. And she thought at first it was something mechanical, and then she got closer and realized he was singing. Something old and quiet in a voice that was nothing like the closed flat tone he used to talk to her. It was a different voice entirely. It had room in it. She stood outside the barn door for a moment listening. She did not go in. She went back to the cabin and put water on to boil and told herself it meant nothing. On the 7th day, one of his cattle went through a fence at the east pasture, and he spent most of the day chasing it across terrain that was unkind to both men and cows. He came in after dark, later than usual, covered in mud, and moving with the careful stiffness of a man who had done damage to something he would be feeling for a week. She had kept supper warm. She put it on the table without comment, and he sat down and ate and was quiet for a long time. "Thank you," he said finally. "It was ready," she said. "It wasn't any trouble." "Still." She sat down across from him with her own plate. "Did you get the cow?" "Eventually." He looked at his food. "She's back where she belongs." "Good." He was quiet again. Then, "My wife used to do this." Elizabeth looked up. "Keep supper warm," he said. "She thought it was important. I didn't understand why until she was gone, and there was nothing warm when I came in." He stopped, set down his fork. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that." "Don't apologize," Elizabeth said. "It's not appropriate. Nathan." She said his name with more firmness than she intended. He looked at her. "Don't apologize for mentioning her. She was your wife. She was important to you. You're allowed to say so." He looked at her for a long moment. That same careful reading look he had given her the first day. "She would have liked you," he said. Elizabeth did not know what to do with that either. She looked down at her plate. "Tell me about her," she said quietly. And so he did. Slowly, carefully, with the kind of deliberateness of a man who had not spoken certain words in a very long time and was choosing each one. He told her about Margaret, who had laughed too loud and argued with him about everything and kept a garden that was the most organized thing in his life. He told her about his brother James, who was 24 and had come up to help him that last winter, and who had laughed just like Margaret and been just as stubborn. He told her about the storm that came in without warning, the kind of storm the mountains produced with no apology and no mercy, and he told her what happened in a voice that was steady and entirely flat, which was somehow worse than if it had been shaking. He did not tell her about the accusations. Not yet. But she heard what was underneath what he said, the layer of guilt, the layer of grief, the layer of something that had hardened over time into the closed, careful face he showed the world. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. "I'm truly sorry." 3 years ago, he said. "You'd think—" He stopped. "You'd think it gets easier." "Does it?" "No," he said. "You just get better at carrying it." Elizabeth looked at her hands on the table. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly right." He looked at her. He did not ask what she meant, but she saw him register it, the weight of those words, the particular knowledge behind them, and file it away with the careful attention of a man who noticed things. She went to bed that night with something different in her chest. Not comfort exactly, not safety. Something more tentative than that. Something that felt like the first thread of a thing that might with time and patience become trust. On the 10th day she went into town. She needed thread and flour and a few household items, and Nathan offered to drive her, but she told him she was capable of handling it herself. And he looked at her for a moment and then said all right, and told her the mare on the left was more reliable and gave her directions to the general store. Harrow Creek received her the way it had received her on the first day, with stares and the particular buzzing quiet that meant people had been talking before she arrived and were now pausing the conversation out of a courtesy that was mostly performance. The woman at the general store was about 50 with a face that had started as pretty and curdled into something shrewder. She took Elizabeth's list and began pulling items from shelves with efficient movements and a silence that felt deliberate. "You're Nathan Cole's wife," she said finally. Not a question. "I am," Elizabeth said. The woman looked at her directly. "How long have you been up there?" 10 days. Something shifted in the woman's expression. "And you're still here?" Elizabeth met her eyes. "Yes." The woman was quiet for a moment. She set a bag of flour on the counter. "Most women who come out here to marry him don't last a week. There was one before you who left after 2 days. Didn't even take all her things." "I'm not her," Elizabeth said. "No," the woman said. "I suppose you're not." She paused. "You know what happened, with his wife, his brother." "I know some of it. He killed them." The woman said it flatly without cruelty, just the flat certainty of a fact long settled. "Maybe not with his own hands, but he's the reason they died. He kept them up on that mountain when the storm hit, and he didn't get them out in time, and they froze. Both of them." Elizabeth looked at her. "Who told you that?" she said. "Everyone knows." "Who specifically told you that?" Elizabeth said. "Who was there? Who saw it?" The woman blinked. This was apparently not the response she expected. "That's what people say." "People say a great many things," Elizabeth said carefully. "I've had things said about me that weren't true. I expect most people have." She picked up her purchases and put her money on the counter. "Thank you for the supplies." She walked out. She sat in the wagon for a moment before she clicked the mare forward, her heart going faster than the situation warranted. She had not planned to say that. She had planned to listen and say nothing and process it later, which was what she did, what she had always done. But something about the flat certainty of "he killed them" had made her chest clench with a recognition she hadn't expected. She knew what it was to have something decided about you, to have a story told until it became the only story, until the truth of who you were was buried so completely under the version others preferred that you almost forgot what was real. She drove back up the mountain and put away the supplies and did not say anything to Nathan about the conversation. But that evening, when they sat in their customary silence with their books, she looked up at him and said, "Do you want to tell me what actually happened with Margaret and James?" He looked up from his book. His face did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. "Not tonight," he said. "All right." He looked back at his book. "Then, but I will, if you want to hear it." "I do," she said. "When you're ready." He nodded. She went back to her reading. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the dark, and the fire cracked and settled, and somewhere on the mountain a coyote called once and was answered by silence. Elizabeth Carter sat in a cabin in Montana with a stranger who was becoming something she didn't have a word for yet, and for the first time in 2 years, she did not feel like she was disappearing. She felt tentatively and with great caution and with full awareness that she might be wrong about all of it. She felt like she might be beginning. 3 weeks into her life at Black Pine Ridge, Elizabeth stopped counting the days. She wasn't sure when it happened exactly. Somewhere between the second time she reorganized his ledgers and the first time he laughed, a short, surprised sound, more exhale than anything, when she told him that his cattle records were organized with all the logic of a man who had never met a number he didn't immediately distrust. He hadn't expected her to say that. She hadn't expected to say it either. But it came out, and he made that sound, and afterward the air in the cabin felt different. Lighter. Like something that had been braced for impact had slowly, carefully stood down. She stopped counting, because counting had been a defense mechanism. A way of reminding herself that this was temporary, that she was still in the early phase of an arrangement, that she should not settle too deeply into anything, because she did not yet know what kind of man Nathan Cole actually was. Counting the days was how she kept her bags metaphorically packed. But somewhere around day 18 or 19, she realized her bags had been unpacked, without her consciously deciding to unpack them. That frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Nathan noticed things. She had figured that out early, that behind the closed face and the flat voice was a man who paid attention with a precision that most people didn't bother with. He noticed when she favored her right hand over her left when she was tired. He noticed that she always read the same passage twice when something was troubling her. He noticed that she ate less when she was anxious, and more when she was content, and she knew he noticed because he quietly adjusted the portions he brought in from the cold store on the days she was anxious, as if he could compensate for what she wasn't taking in by simply making more available. He never said any of this. He just did it. It was, she thought, the most disorienting form of consideration she had ever encountered. On a Tuesday morning, she knew it was Tuesday because she had started keeping track of days for the accounts rather than for herself. A rider came up from Harrow Creek. She heard the horse before she saw it, and she came to the door to find Nathan already outside, standing at the edge of the porch, with his arms loose at his sides in the particular way he stood when he was being careful. The rider was a young man, maybe 20, with a hat too big for his head and a letter in his hand that he clearly did not want to be delivering. "Mr. Cole," the young man said. "Hale," Nathan said. "What is it?" Not a question, a statement. The tone of a man who had received enough bad news to know its approach. Hale, the young man, looked at the letter in his hand. "It's from Mr. Whitmore's office, his solicitor." He held it out. "I was told to wait for a response." Nathan took the letter. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where his jaw set in a particular way and his eyes went very still. "You can tell Whitmore's solicitor," Nathan said, "that I've received the letter." "Sir, he said he needed—" "I heard what you said, Hale." Nathan's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You can tell him I received it. That's all." Hale looked like he wanted to say more and had decided against it. He turned his horse around and started back down the mountain. Nathan stood with the letter in his hand for a long moment. Then he came back inside. Elizabeth was at the table, pretending she had not been watching every second of that exchange through the window. He put the letter on the table and sat down across from her and opened it. She watched his face as he read. It told her nothing. His face almost never told her anything directly, but she had become skilled at reading what was underneath. And what was underneath right now was controlled anger. The kind that had been banked for a long time and was being kept deliberately low. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "No," he said. He folded the letter and set it down. "Charles Whitmore wants to buy this land. You've received offers before. This is the fourth." He looked at the letter. "This one comes with a number that's meant to make me feel like I have no reasonable argument for refusing." "What's the number?" He told her. It was, in fact, a significant number. More than she would have expected for mountain land, even good mountain land. "And you're going to refuse," she said. "Yes, because of the water source." He looked up at her sharply. She had read enough of his survey documents and land records in the process of organizing his files to know about the spring on the eastern edge of his property. The one that fed 3 downstream water rights and was the reason this particular 300 acres was worth considerably more than what Whitmore was offering. "You found that in the records," he said. "You have very thorough survey documents," she said. "Once I put them in the right order, they told quite a story." He looked at her for a long moment. "The spring feeds water rights for 6 properties below mine, including 2 families that have been here since before I was. If Whitmore gets this land, he gets the spring. He gets the spring, he controls the water, he controls everything downstream. And Whitmore knows this. Whitmore's the one who figured it out," Nathan said. "That's why the number keeps going up." Elizabeth looked at the letter on the table. "Have you spoken to anyone about this? A lawyer? Someone in the territorial government?" "I've written to Billings. Twice. I haven't heard back." He paused. "Men like Whitmore have long arms." She understood what he meant. She had spent enough time watching her father's business fail and understanding exactly who was responsible for the conditions that made it fail to know how that particular machinery worked. "What does he say in the letter?" she asked. beyond the number. Nathan picked it up and read, "Should you decline this generous offer, we must advise that our client will be compelled to pursue all available legal remedies regarding boundary disputes currently on record, as well as certain questions pertaining to water rights access that have not yet been formally adjudicated." He set the letter down, which means he's going to dig up every unclear property line and unresolved claim from the last 20 years and bury me in litigation I can't afford. That's... Elizabeth stopped, started again. That's a threat wrapped in legal language. That's exactly what it is. She sat with that for a moment. Nathan, I need to see all of your property documents, not just the surveys. The original land grant, the title, records, the water rights filings. Everything. He looked at her. Why? Because if he's going to come at you through the courts, then the courts are where you fight him. And to fight him there, you need to know exactly what your legal position is before he does. She paused. I know what I'm doing with records. It's what I was trained for. Let me look. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the locked box under the window seat. She had noticed it but had not asked about it, and brought it to the table and opened it. Inside was a collection of documents that made her organized heart ache. They were all there. The original land grant, the territorial title, registration, the water rights filings in triplicate. But they were folded haphazardly, some of them stuck together, some of them with handwritten annotations in margins that had faded to near illegibility. She looked at Nathan. How long have you had this box? She said. Since I bought the land. And you've never... She stopped. Never mind. Give me 2 days. He gave her the box. She stayed up that night until the fire burned low, reading every page with a lantern pulled close. Nathan did not tell her to go to bed. He brought her coffee at 9 o'clock, and then at 11, and then at some point close to 1 in the morning, he put a blanket over her shoulders without saying anything and went to his bedroll. She didn't notice until the cold would have woken her, and found it there instead, and she sat for a moment with her hand on the wool of it, and felt something happen in her chest that she was not prepared to examine closely. She found what she was looking for at 2 in the morning. It was a water rights filing from 1861, predating Nathan's purchase of the land that established the spring as a communal water source for all downstream properties, which meant it could not be privatized by any single landowner without the consent of all parties who held downstream rights. The filing was obscure, handwritten, signed by a territorial water commissioner, whose name she did not recognize, and it had been stuck between 2 pages of a survey document that nobody had apparently looked at in 15 years. If that filing was valid, and she believed it was, then Whitmore's entire legal strategy collapsed. He couldn't control the spring even if he bought the land, because the spring didn't belong exclusively to the land. It belonged to everyone downstream. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she went to the door of the main room and said quietly, "Nathan." There was a pause. Then, "I'm awake. I found something." He was sitting up before she finished the sentence. She showed him the document. She explained what it meant. He read it once, then again, and then he set it down on the table and looked at it for a long time. "This changes things," he said. "It changes everything," she said. "If this document is registered correctly, Whitmore has no legal basis for his strategy. Buying your land wouldn't give him what he wants, because what he wants isn't yours to sell. We need to verify the filing," he said. "We need to get it to someone in the territorial government who can't be reached by Whitmore's arm," she said. "Someone with authority to confirm the registration." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a federal land commissioner in Helena. I've never met him, but he's federal. Whitmore's local connections don't reach that far." "Then we write to him," Elizabeth said, "tonight if possible, and we include copies of this document and the relevant survey references." Nathan looked up at her. In the lamplight in the middle of the night, with her hair down and a blanket still around her shoulders, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the careful, closed look. It was not the controlled neutrality. It was something stripped of all that, something direct and genuine and a little bit raw. "You knew what you were looking for," he said. When you asked for these documents, you already had a theory. I had a hypothesis, she said, based on what I know about how men like Whitmore operate. They use legal language to create the impression of a stronger position than they actually have. The threat is usually more effective than the action because the threat doesn't require them to actually win in court, it just requires you to be afraid to find out. He was quiet for a long moment. Where did you learn that? He asked. She met his eyes. From watching it happen to my father. He did not press. She did not offer more. But something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an acknowledgement of shared knowledge about the way the world worked and the cost of learning it, and she felt it settle between them like something solid. They wrote the letter to the federal commissioner together, she drafting and he reviewing, and by the time they were finished, the fire had died to coals and the first gray light was starting at the edges of the window. Go to sleep, he said. You too. I will. She went to her room and lay down and was asleep within 3 minutes. She did not dream about the past that night. She did not dream about hands in the dark or the sick, helpless feeling of being pinned in place. She dreamed about nothing, which was its own kind of gift. The letter went out with the next writer to Harrow Creek. The response from the federal commissioner would take time. Letters moved slowly in Montana in 1878, and in the meantime, they went on with the rhythms of the ranch, the cattle, the accounts, the mornings with coffee and evenings with books, and the particular texture of a silence that had changed over 5 weeks into something neither of them commented on, but both of them felt. It was around this time that Elizabeth started hearing more of what the town was saying. She went to Harrow Creek every week or 10 days for supplies and errands, and she had learned to move through those visits with her head up and her expression neutral, but she was not deaf. She heard the way conversations shifted when she walked into the general store. She heard her name said alongside Nathan's in tones that ranged from pity to skepticism to something that was almost prurient. People speculating about what happened up there on the mountain, what kind of marriage it was, what kind of woman would stay with a man the town had decided was responsible for the deaths of his own family. What she hadn't expected was the day she walked out of the general store and nearly walked into a wall of 2 women and a man who had apparently been waiting for her. The women she recognized vaguely from church. The man was older, with a white beard, and the kind of authority that came from long tenure in a small place. Mrs. Cole, the man said. Mr. She didn't know his name. Garrett, he said. I'm the head deacon at First Church. These are Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Price. He paused. We wanted to speak with you. Elizabeth shifted her purchases to her other arm. I'm listening. We're concerned about your welfare, Mrs. Hale said. She had a soft voice and eyes that were doing a lot of work to appear compassionate. Up there alone with that man, there are things you may not know. Tell me what you think I don't know, Elizabeth said. Garrett cleared his throat. The story of the storm. 3 years passed. His wife and his brother. I know about the storm, Elizabeth said. Then you know what he did. I know what you say he did, Elizabeth said. I've heard that version. I haven't heard evidence of it. Mrs. Price made a sound that might have been surprise or disapproval. Mrs. Cole, we saw what that winter did to him. He wasn't right in the head afterward. There's a violence in him. Has he been violent? Elizabeth said, directly, that you've witnessed. Silence. Has he struck someone, threatened someone, done something illegal? More silence. Or is what you mean, she said, carefully not raising her voice, that he kept to himself after his family died, that he stopped coming to town, that he didn't behave the way you expected a grieving man to behave, and that you told a story about him, to explain the behavior that was easier than admitting you didn't go up there to help him when he needed it. Mrs. Hale's face went through several rapid expressions. Garrett's jaw tightened. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Elizabeth said. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the story you've all been telling for 3 years isn't necessarily the whole truth. She paused. Because I've lived on that mountain for 5 weeks, and the man you're describing doesn't match the man I know. She excused herself and walked to the wagon and drove back up the mountain with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingers on the reins. She told Nathan about the conversation that evening. Not immediately, she let dinner happen first, let the ordinary rhythm of the evening establish itself. Then she told him. He went very still. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." "Elizabeth, they were wrong," she said. "They've been telling a story about you for 3 years, and they've said it so many times, it's become the truth to them, and I didn't—" She stopped. She looked at her hands. "I know what it is to have a story told about you that isn't true. I couldn't just listen to it." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, rougher at the edges, like something had shifted in the machinery of it. "What story did they tell about you?" he said. She looked up. He was watching her with that stripped-down look again, the one that wasn't performing anything. She had not talked about this, not with anyone. Not in 2 years, not in 11 days on a stagecoach, not in 5 weeks on a mountain with a man she was coming to, with a man she was coming to trust. The word landed in her mind like something heavy and breakable. "His name was Gerald Marsh," she said. "He was a business partner of my father's. When my father became ill, when the business started to fail, Gerald offered to help. He said he would keep the business solvent. He said he would take care of us." She paused. "I was 20. I believed him." Nathan did not move. "He didn't take care of the business," she said. "He took what was worth taking, and he left. And when my father died 6 months later, there was nothing. No business. No savings. No reputation, because Gerald made sure before he left that the people who might have helped us understood that the failure was my father's fault. That my father had been mismanaging things for years." She paused again. "My father was the most careful businessman I've ever known. Gerald Marsh is the reason I can read a ledger the way I can. My father taught me everything. And Gerald spent 2 years destroying what my father built, and then made sure everyone believed my father was to blame." The fire was the only sound in the room. "And you," Nathan said quietly. "What did he do to you?" It was not quite a question. She looked at her hands on the table. "He convinced me that I loved him," she said. "And then he made it very clear that what he wanted from me was not what I had believed it was." She stopped. He didn't take anything. I didn't—" She stopped again. "That's not entirely true. There were ways in which what happened was—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nathan's jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working in it. "I'm all right," she said. "I want to be clear that I am all right. I came out the other side of it. But it is the reason I arrived here the way I did. The reason I—" She paused. "The reason the first night was what it was." "I know," he said. "You couldn't have known. I knew something had happened," he said. "I didn't know what. I didn't need to know what. I just knew that whatever it wasn't nothing." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The story they told about me," she said finally, "was that I had been Gerald's mistress, that I had encouraged him, that the collapse of the business was partly because I had been—" She shook her head. It wasn't true. But it was easier for people to believe than the truth, which was that a respected man had manipulated a young woman and then abandoned her. Because the truth required believing a respected man had done something wrong, Nathan said. "Yes," she said. Which is exactly what they did with me," he said. They looked at each other. She felt something unlock in her chest, some last remaining bolt she hadn't even known was still shot, and it made her breath catch. "Yes," she said. "Exactly what they did with you." He stood up from the table and went to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. His shoulders were set in that way they got when he was feeling something he didn't have a ready mechanism for. Then he turned around. "Gerald Marsh," he said. "Where is he now?" "Denver," she said. "Or he was last I heard. He's made himself very comfortable." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Do you want me to—" "No," she said, quickly, then more quietly. "No. I don't want him anywhere near my life again. in any form. He nodded. All right. Nathan. She waited until he was looking at her directly. What they told me about you, in town, about the storm. Will you tell me what actually happened? Not what they say. What you know. He came back to the table and sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing something painful into words. The storm came in from the northwest, he said. The kind that happens 2-3 times a decade up here, no warning. 50-mile-an-hour winds drops to 20 below in 4 hours. Margaret and James had come out for the week. We knew snow was coming. We didn't know what kind. He paused. I sent for help from town 2 hours after it started. Sent our hand Eddie, young kid about Hale's age. He made it down the mountain, and he went to Garrett, and he went to the Price family, and he went to the man who ran the saloon who had a big team. And none of them came. Silence. The road was bad, Elizabeth said quietly. The road was bad. Nathan agreed. I know that. I have never said the road was easy, but Eddie made it down in a bad road and bad weather because he was 20 years old and riding hard. What they did or didn't do I can't say. What I know is that nobody came. He paused. James went out to check on the cattle. The wind had died down and we thought it was over. It wasn't over. It came back worse. He got turned around in the dark. By the time I found him... He stopped. Elizabeth did not fill the silence. She let it be what it was. Margaret had been coughing all week, he said. Before the storm. I should have... He stopped again. The cold made it worse. We didn't have what we needed up here because I hadn't thought it would. He put his hand flat on the table, pressing down like he was trying to anchor himself to something. She died 2 days later. Pneumonia. He lifted his hand from the table. The town decided it was my fault because I was the one left. Because James and Margaret couldn't tell their version. Because grief looks like guilt if you squint at it the right way, and you've already decided what you're seeing. Elizabeth looked at him across the table. You've been carrying this for 3 years, she said. I've been carrying a lot longer than that, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She did it before she thought about doing it. It was not a romantic gesture, or not only that, not in the way that word usually implied. It was the gesture of one person saying to another person, I see you. Not the version they made of you. You. He looked down at her hand on his. He did not move his own hand away. He turned it over slowly, carefully, and held hers. Elizabeth, he said. I know, she said. I don't... He stopped. I'm not certain what this is. Neither am I, she said. But I'm not afraid of it. He looked at her. You're sure, he said, very quietly, as if the question cost him something. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything now, not with the automatic reassurances she had trained herself to offer, but with actual consideration. Yes, she said. I'm sure. He held her hand for a long time without saying anything else. The fire burned low. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the dark of the mountain, something settled into place with the quiet finality of something that had been finding its way home for a long time and had at last arrived. It was the wrong moment then for the sound of a horse coming fast up the road. Nathan heard it first. He lifted his head, and she felt the shift in him immediately, the way he went from the man at the table to something else, something alert and braced in less than a breath. He let go of her hand and went to the door. The rider was Eddie, the same young man he had sent for help the night of the storm 3 years ago, now grown and working at the livery in Harrow Creek. He was riding hard, and his face when Nathan opened the door and the lamplight caught him was the face of someone who had decided to do something that frightened him. Mr. Cole, Eddie said. He was breathing hard. I need to tell you something. Something I should have said a long time ago. Nathan stepped aside to let him in. Eddie stood in the cabin with his hat in his hands and looked at Nathan, and then at Elizabeth, and then back at Nathan with the expression of a man standing on the edge of a bridge. I went to them, Eddie said. That night, 3 years ago, I went to Garrett and I went to Price and I went to Halloran at the saloon. I told them what was happening up here." He swallowed. They knew. All three of them. Garrett said the road was too dangerous. Price said he couldn't risk his team. Halloran said... He stopped. Halloran said Cole's got what's coming to him. The room was very quiet. "They knew," Nathan said. "Yes, sir." "They knew and they made a choice." "Yes, sir." Eddie's voice was barely above a whisper. "And then when it happened, I was the one who carried messages between town for the next month, and I heard what they were saying. About you. And I didn't." He pressed his lips together. "I didn't say anything, because I was 20 years old, and they were the men who ran things around here, and I was afraid." "But you're saying something now," Elizabeth said. Eddie looked at her. "Mr. Whitmore's been going around town saying things about Mr. Cole, trying to get people riled up. And last week he came to me and he asked me, he said he'd heard I was the one who rode for help that night, and he wanted to know if I'd be willing to say in front of people that Mr. Cole had delayed in calling for help, that he'd waited too long before he sent me." His jaw worked. "He offered me money for it." Nathan's expression did not change, but his stillness changed in quality. It became something else entirely, something harder. "He wants you to testify," Elizabeth said. "He said he was going to take Mr. Cole to court over the water rights, and he wanted evidence of character, that Mr. Cole was negligent, that he couldn't be trusted." Eddie looked at Nathan. "I didn't take his money. I want you to know that. But I thought you should know he's building something, and that he's willing to use the worst night of your life to build it." Silence. Nathan stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "You rode up here in the dark to tell me this." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Eddie." The young man nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at Nathan with something that was very close to shame and very close to relief, and landed somewhere between them. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not saying it sooner, for not saying it 3 years ago when it could have, when it might have." "You were 20 years old," Nathan said, "and you rode down a mountain in a blizzard to try to get help. You did what you could." Eddie nodded once more and went. Nathan closed the door. He stood with his hand on the doorframe for a moment, his back to Elizabeth, and she could see the effort it took to hold himself level. The information they had just received had changed everything. Not just the legal situation, the whole architecture of the last 3 years. The grief, the isolation, the story that had been built around him while he sat on this mountain alone and believed on some level that maybe he had deserved it. He had not deserved it. "Nathan," she said. He turned around. His face was the closed face, the controlled face, but his eyes were not controlled. His eyes were something she had never seen in him before, and she understood it because she had felt it herself. The specific shattering that comes when the story you've been told about your own life turns out to be a lie, constructed by people who chose their comfort over your truth. She stood up from the table and crossed the room and stood in front of him. "You didn't fail them," she said. "You hear me? You didn't." "I know," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Those men made a choice," she said. "It wasn't your choice. It wasn't your failure. They decided, and then they told a story so they wouldn't have to live with what they decided." He put his hand against the doorframe, steadying himself. "I've been believing it," he said. "Not all of it, but enough of it. Enough to think that maybe I—" He stopped. "Enough to think I deserve to be alone up here." "You don't," Elizabeth said. "No," he said. "I'm starting to understand that." She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the space between them, in the cabin, in the mountains, in the dark with the fire burning low and the wind in the pines, and the whole complicated, terrible history of two people who had been broken by stories. They didn't write, something shifted. Something that had been building for 5 weeks, and 1,000 small kindnesses, and 2 late-night letters, and one hand placed over another. "What do we do now?" she said. He straightened, and the closed face came back. But it was different this time. Not a wall against the world, but something more like armor put on deliberately by choice, by a man who had decided he was done being defined by what other people had decided about him. "Now," he said, "we fight." The letter from the federal commissioner arrived on a Thursday. Elizabeth heard the writer coming and was at the door before Nathan was, which surprised them both. She had not realized until that moment how much of her energy over the preceding 2 weeks had been oriented toward that road, listening for horses, watching the light change on the slope below, calculating how long a letter to Helena and back should reasonably take. Nathan came up behind her, and she felt him there close, but not touching the way he had learned to be close, in a way that did not crowd her. The writer was a postal courier from Harrow Creek, a weathered man named Cutler, who made the mountain run twice a week and had the incurious expression of someone who had delivered enough news, good and bad, to have stopped attaching himself to any of it. He handed Nathan the envelope without ceremony and turned his horse back down the slope. Nathan brought it inside. He did not open it immediately. He set it on the table and looked at it, and Elizabeth understood why the last 2 weeks had been a specific kind of waiting. The kind where the outcome is uncertain enough that you almost prefer the uncertainty to the verdict. She had felt it herself. She recognized the pause. "Open it," she said. He opened it. He opened. She watched his face as he read. She had learned his face by now, learned to read the small gradations of expression that other people probably missed because they required patience to detect. She saw his jaw unclench slightly. She saw something shift behind his eyes. He set the letter down and looked at her. "The commissioner confirms the 1861 water rights filing," he said. "He says it's valid and registered, and that it establishes the spring as a communal resource not subject to individual privatization." He paused. "He also says that in light of the filing, any legal action Whitmore initiates regarding water rights access will face significant procedural obstacles at the federal level." Elizabeth sat down. The relief was so physical, she felt it in her knees. "That's everything we needed," she said. "He also says something else." Nathan picked the letter back up. "He says he's been made aware of irregularities in several other land transactions in this valley over the past 4 years. He says he intends to send a representative to investigate." Elizabeth looked up. "Whitmore," she said. "It doesn't say Whitmore by name. But there aren't many large-scale land transactions happening in this valley." Nathan set the letter down again. "Someone talked to the commissioner before we did." "Eddie," she said immediately. Nathan shook his head slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe Whitmore's reach isn't as long as he thought it was." She looked at the letter on the table. 2 weeks of waiting. 2 weeks of maintaining the ordinary rhythms of the ranch while this thing hung over them like weather. And now this, a piece of paper from a federal office that had just dismantled the most powerful threat they faced. She should have felt purely relieved. Instead, she felt the first cold edge of a different fear, because she knew men like Whitmore. Not this specific man, but the type, the architecture of how they thought what they did when the legal path closed. Her father's story had not ended when Gerald Marsh's business maneuver was exposed. It had gotten worse. "He's going to know," she said. "About the commissioner's letter. He has people in the postal service probably, or at the very least, he'll know from the courier routes that something came through from Helena. He'll know his legal strategy just collapsed." Nathan looked at her. "And when his legal strategy collapses," she continued, "men like him don't retreat. They escalate." He held her gaze. "I know. I need you to understand that I'm saying this not to frighten you, Elizabeth." His voice was quiet but direct. "I've known Whitmore was capable of this since the second letter. I've been thinking about it." She exhaled. "What do we do?" "We don't wait for him to make the next move," Nathan said. "We make ours first." The next morning, Nathan rode to Harrow Creek. Alone, which Elizabeth disliked but accepted because she understood there were conversations that required him. Specifically required his history in this place. His name, the weight of what the town owed him. She made him take the letter from the commissioner. She made him promise to show it to anyone who would stand still long enough to read it. He was gone for 5 hours. When he came back with 3 men in the wagon behind him. She recognized 2 of them. Brant Hollis, who ran a cattle operation on the lower slope, and whose water rights were directly downstream of the coal spring, and a younger man named Peregrine Sachs, whose family had been in the valley since before the war, and who had a reputation for plain speaking and no love for outside money, coming in to disrupt what was already there. The third man, she didn't know he was older, dressed better than the other 2, and had the kind of stillness that came from professional training. Nathan introduced him as Thomas Reeves. He was a land and property attorney from Billings, who had arrived in Harrow Creek 2 days prior, and had apparently been asking questions about Charles Whitmore. He's representing 3 other families who've had dealings with Whitmore. Nathan told her that evening after the men had left with copies of the water rights document and agreements to meet again in 2 days. Apparently, we're not the only ones he's pressured. How many families? 6 that Reeves knows of, all holding land that connects to water access. Whitmore's been working this valley for 4 years, and he's been very careful about it, approaching each family separately, making sure nobody compared notes. His jaw tightened. It almost worked. What changed? The Connolly family, about 15 miles south. Their son-in-law is a journalist in Billings. He started pulling threads. Nathan paused. And apparently, one of the families talked to a federal land office about an irregular survey claim, and it landed on the commissioner's desk at the same time our letter did. Elizabeth sat with this for a moment. We weren't the only ones who figured it out. We were the first to document the water rights issue specifically, Nathan said. Reeves says that's the keystone. If we establish that the spring can't be privatized, the whole structure of what Whitmore is trying to build falls apart. So what does he do, she said, when he realizes the structure is falling? Nathan met her eyes. That's what Reeves and I talked about for 2 hours in the saloon this afternoon. She waited. Reeves says Whitmore will have had the courier's route watched. He'll know the letter came. He might know who it's from, which means he knows his legal position is compromised, and he knows we know it. Nathan's voice was steady, but the quality of his stillness was the same one she'd seen the night Eddie came with his news alert. Braced, controlled anger running just beneath the surface. Reeves thinks we have 3 to 5 days before he moves. Moves how? He doesn't know exactly. Could be intimidation. Could be something to damage reputation. More stories, different stories, something we can't counter with a legal document. He paused. Could be something physical. The word sat in the air between them. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about the barn, about the cattle, about the land records currently organized into careful stacks in the locked box under the window seat. All the things that constituted this life on this mountain. All the things that could be undone in a night by a man with enough money and enough absence of conscience. We need to get the documents somewhere safe, she said. Already thought of that. The originals, not just copies. I rode to Reeves's hotel room this afternoon with the original water rights filing and the land grant. He has them locked in his case. Nathan looked at her. I made copies. Copies are here. She exhaled. Then, he doesn't just want the land. No. He wants to establish that she stopped. That you're the kind of man nobody believes. That anything you say about him can be discredited. He's been building that story for 3 years, hasn't he? The accident? The isolation? The town thinking you're dangerous? She paused. He knew about you before he knew about the spring. Nathan went very still. Say that again, he said. Whitmore's been working this valley for 4 years. The accident happened 3 years ago. If he was already here, already watching the water access situation, and then the accident happened, and the town turned on you. She looked at him. That's very convenient timing for a man who needs people not to trust you. The silence that followed was very different from the comfortable silences they had built over 6 weeks. You think he had something to do with it? Nathan said. His voice was flat. With the town turning. I think he may have helped it along, she said carefully. I don't know if he manufactured it, but a story that's already forming is much easier to push in a particular direction than one that isn't there yet. Nathan stood up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there for a long moment. She waited. Garrett, he said. And Price. Halloran. He named them the same way he had named the storm that night she'd asked him to tell her flatly, without expression, which was worse than expression. If Whitmore had gotten to any of them before the storm, he would have had reason to make sure the story went the way it went afterward, Elizabeth said. Yes. Nathan turned around. His face was set in something she hadn't seen before, not the controlled anger she'd learned to read, but something harder. Something that had reached a conclusion. "We need Eddie," he said. "Eddie already told us Whitmore offered him money to testify. Not for that." Nathan reached for his coat. Eddie was at the saloon when Halloran turned him away that night. Eddie heard what Halloran said. And Eddie's been in this valley all his life. He knows who talks to who owes who. Whitmore's been meeting with at the saloon for the past 4 years. He was at the door. "Nathan." She stood up. "It's nearly dark. I'll be back before midnight." "That's not what I—" She stopped. She looked at him. "Be careful." He looked back at her from the doorway, and his expression shifted into something she didn't have a precise name for. Something that was not just the checked feeling she had seen in him before. Something that was more open than that. "I will be," he said. He was back at 10. He came in the door with Eddie Hale behind him, and Eddie looked like a man who had been asked to do something that frightened him, and had decided to do it anyway, which was becoming a recognizable expression on him. "Tell her what you told me," Nathan said. Eddie sat down at the table. He held his hat in both hands. He looked at Elizabeth, and then at the hat, and then back at Elizabeth. "Whitmore's been coming to Harrow Creek for 4 years, he said. "Not regular, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. He stays at the hotel, and he meets with people at the saloon, Halloran's Saloon, private meetings back room." He paused. "I work at the livery. I see who comes and goes. I see what horses get stabled and how long they're there." "Who did he meet with?" Elizabeth asked. "Garrett a bunch of times. Price twice that I saw. A man from the Territorial Land Office. I don't know his name, but I've seen the same man twice over 2 years. Eddie paused. "And about a month before the storm 3 years ago, he was here. Had a long meeting with Halloran. 2 hours maybe. I remember because it was a bad weather day, and normally Halloran's back room was used for cards, and they cleared it out for just the 2 of them." The room went quiet. "A month before," Nathan said. "Yes, sir?" "You didn't tell me this before," Nathan said. His voice was even, not accusing, genuinely asking. "I didn't know it meant something before," Eddie said. "I just thought it was business. Rich man doing business with the saloon owner, that's not unusual." He swallowed. "But after what you told me today, about the water rights, about what Whitmore's been building." "It's not proof," Elizabeth said carefully. "Not to dismiss it, to be precise. A meeting 4 years ago doesn't prove he influenced what happened after the storm." "No," Nathan said. "But it's a thread." "Reeves needs to know," she said. "In the morning," Nathan said. "Tonight." He looked at Eddie. "Where are you sleeping?" Eddie blinked. "Sir, you rode up here in the dark to tell me things Whitmore doesn't want told. If he has people watching the roads—" "I can take care of myself," Eddie said. "I know you can," Nathan said. "But you'll take the loft tonight anyway." Something moved through Eddie's expression, something young and surprised, and trying not to show how much it meant. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "Thank you." Nathan nodded and poured him coffee, and that was the end of it. Elizabeth lay in her bed that night and did not sleep. She listened to the mountain and ran calculations in her head the way she did when she was anxious. Not specific numbers, just the habit of ordered thinking, trying to map what she knew into shapes she could understand. Whitmore knew his legal position was compromised. He had 3 to 5 days before Reeves could get anything in front of a federal court. He had resources, and he had local connections, and he had a story about Nathan Cole that the town of Harrow Creek had been marinating in for 3 years. And he had shown in his approach to Eddie that he was not above suborning testimony. She thought about the documents in Reeves's locked case. She thought about the copies in the locked box. She thought about the barn and the cattle, and the 300 acres of mountain that Nathan had built his life on, and that 2 dead people he had loved were buried at the edge of. She thought about what it would mean to lose it. Then she thought about what it would mean to fight for it. She had never fought for anything. Not directly. She had survived. She had been careful and strategic, and she had endured, and she had made the best choices available to her, but she had never stood in a room and said, "No, you don't get to do this," in a voice that required the room to hear it. She thought about what she had said to the women outside the general store. The words had come out of her without planning, and what they had cost her in that moment was less than she expected. The ground had not opened up and swallowed her. The world had not ended. She had said true things, and the world had received them. She got up before dawn and started the coffee. Nathan came in from the barn. He had gone out quietly before she rose. Probably couldn't sleep either, and stopped in the doorway when he saw her at the stove. "You're up," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the town meeting." He came inside and took off his coat. "What town meeting?" "The one we're going to call." She poured him coffee and turned around to face him. "Reeves has documents. Eddie has testimony. We have the commissioner's letter, and you have 3 years of silence that has allowed a story to exist about you that isn't true." She held his gaze. "What we don't have is anyone in that town knowing what we know. And Whitmore's power in this valley comes directly from controlling what people know." Nathan looked at her. "You want to go public," he said. "Before he does something that makes it impossible to respond," she said. "Yes." "Elizabeth." He set his coffee down. That town has been telling a story about you because nobody gave them a reason to question it," she said. "We have reasons now. Legal documents, a federal commissioner's letter, and a man who was there the night of the storm who is willing to say what actually happened." She paused. "And us, standing in front of them, together." He was quiet for a long time. "You'd stand up in front of Harrow Creek," he said. "Yes." "And say what?" "The truth," she said. "All of it in whatever order it needs to come out." He picked up his coffee again, drank it. She could see him thinking through it the way he thought through everything thoroughly, without rushing accounting for the weight of each element. "There's a deacons meeting Thursday," he said slowly. "Garrett runs them, but they're open. All the property owners in the valley are supposed to attend." "Thursday is 4 days away," Elizabeth said. "Reeves said 3 to 5. "It's also a room that contains everyone Whitmore has done business with in this valley," Nathan said, "and everyone he's threatened. If we're going to say what we know, that's where it lands with the most weight." Elizabeth looked at him. "Are you saying yes?" He met her eyes. "I'm saying Thursday." They sent word to Reeves that morning. Reeves came up to the ranch that afternoon, and they sat together for 3 hours, going through every document, every piece of testimony, every thread they had, organizing it into a sequence that would be comprehensible to a room full of people who had been fed a different story for 3 years. Reeves was a methodical man, which Elizabeth appreciated. He laid things out the way she laid out ledger columns, each entry in its proper place, the balance emerging from the order rather than being imposed on top of it. "The water rights document is the foundation," Reeves said. "You establish that first. Before you say anything about Whitmore, before you say anything about the storm or the testimony, you establish that there is a registered federal filing that makes his entire strategy legally invalid. Because once that's established," Elizabeth said, "everything else he's done reads as actions taken to pursue an illegal goal." "Exactly." Reeves nodded at her. "You've done this kind of analysis before." "Something like it," she said. Reeves looked at her, then at Nathan, then back at her. "With Mrs. Cole working the documents," he said to Nathan, "and your testimony, and Eddie Hale's, we have a strong case. I'll be honest with you, I've seen better organized cases fail, and worse organized cases succeed. What I can't control is the room." "I can handle the room," Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. She looked back steadily. "I know what it is to be in a room that has already decided what it thinks about you," she said. I know how to speak in that room. That's mine to manage." Nathan was looking at her with an expression that she was starting to recognize, the one that still surprised her every time, because she had not expected to ever see it directed at her. Not wariness, not calculation. Something much simpler than that. Pride. "All right," Reeves said. 2 days before the Thursday meeting, the barn burned. Not completely. Nathan smelled the smoke before it caught, fully came out of the cabin at 2 in the morning, with a shout that brought Elizabeth out of her room, and Eddie scrambling down from the loft, and they spent 40 minutes with bucket lines from the well, all three of them throwing water at the east wall until the fire died back to nothing. The cattle got out through the north pasture gate, and rounding them back took until dawn. When the light came up, they stood at the edge of the damaged barn. The east wall scorched, one of the support beams, compromised, a season's worth of stored feed in the east section, destroyed. Elizabeth looked at the damage with her jaw set and her hands at her sides, and something cold and clarifying moving through her. "He's telling us something," Eddie said. "He's telling us he knows the Thursday meeting is coming," Nathan said. "He's telling us to reconsider. He burned the feed," Elizabeth said. "Not the structure, not the cattle. He burned things that can be replaced, but that will cost you a season's worth of work." She looked at Nathan. "This is a warning, not an ending. He could have burned the whole thing." "He wants you scared enough to back down," Eddie said. "But not so scared you involve the law before Thursday." "He miscalculated," Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. "He doesn't know what we have," she said. "He knows about the commissioner's letter he probably had that from the courier route. He might know about Reeves being here. But he doesn't know about Eddie. He doesn't know what Eddie saw 4 years ago." She paused. "And he doesn't know what I'm going to say Thursday." She turned to Nathan. "This has to be Thursday," she said. "If we wait, he escalates again. Something worse than feed." Nathan looked at the burned wall. He was very still for a long moment. Then, "We rebuild the wall after Thursday," he said. "Get some rest, both of you. We have 2 days." The next day, something unexpected happened. Brant Hollis came up the mountain, not summoned, not invited, on his own initiative, with 2 of his ranch hands and enough lumber to make a start on the damaged beam. He showed up at 8 in the morning and looked at Nathan and said, "I heard about your barn." And Nathan looked at him for a moment and said, "I didn't ask for help." And Hollis said, "No, but I'm offering it anyway." They worked for 4 hours in near silence. Hollis's hands knew what they were doing, and Nathan worked alongside them without ceremony. And Elizabeth brought coffee out twice, and nobody said much about what was happening or why, but she understood what it meant. Hollis had read the commissioner's letter. Hollis had his own downstream water rights. Hollis had been in this valley for 20 years, and he had watched Nathan Cole be turned into a story, and had not said anything about it, and now he was here with lumber. It was not absolution, but it was something. By midday, 2 other men she didn't know had appeared at the property line and asked if they could help. By afternoon, there were 6 of them, and the east wall of the barn was more than half restored, and the conversation had expanded into something quieter and more significant than lumber people talking about Whitmore, about the letters they'd received, about the pressure, about what they hadn't known to compare, until Reeves started asking questions. Nathan stood in the middle of it with a hammer in his hand and a look on his face that she had not seen before. Not the controlled face, not the stripped-down face from the late nights by the fire. Something different, something that was being reconstructed in real time in front of her by 6 men with lumber and the willingness to show up. She went inside to start making enough food for 8 people and found herself standing at the stove with her eyes stinging. She did not cry. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment and breathed and told herself to stop it. She cooked. She cooked more than she'd cooked since arriving here, and she set the table for 8, and they came in at dusk covered in sawdust, and the dinner was loud. In a way, the cabin had never been loud, and Nathan sat at the head of it with the same stunned expression he'd had out in the yard eating his dinner, while 6 men argued about Whitmore's business practices and the federal water rights filing and what Thursday should look like. She watched him from across the table, and when his eyes found hers, she held them. just for a moment. He looked like a man learning very slowly and with considerable difficulty that he was not as alone as he had believed himself to be. After the men left and Eddie was asleep in the loft, Nathan came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "You didn't have to cook all that," he said. "I know," she said. "It's late. You should rest before." "Nathan!" She turned around. "Tomorrow night will be harder than tonight." "I know. Whitmore is going to do something between now and Thursday morning," she said. "He's not done. The barn was the first move, not the last." Nathan looked at her. "And if he does? Then we deal with it and we go anyway," she said. "Because that's what you do. That's what we do." She paused. "Unless you've changed your mind." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight, the late hour, the quiet of the mountain. "No," he said. "I haven't changed my mind." "Good." She untied her apron. "Then get some sleep." She went to her room and lay down. Outside, the wind had died and the mountain was very still, and somewhere below them, in the town of Harrow Creek, a man named Charles Whitmore was calculating his next move. She lay in the dark and thought about the morning, about the room she would walk into, about the things she had never said out loud to anyone, and would now say in front of the entire valley, about the man on the other side of the wall who had waited for her and believed her and held her hand in the dark and never once asked for anything she wasn't ready to give. She thought about what it meant to fight for something. She had survived 2 years of her life by letting things happen to her and managing the aftermath. She had come to Montana to do the same, to manage the aftermath of her own life from a safe and practical distance. But somewhere on this mountain, in the space between late-night coffee and a barn fire and a hand turned over in the dark, something had changed. She was not managing the aftermath anymore. She was in the middle of something, and she was not afraid. Wednesday night, the second attack came. Not fire this time. Something quieter and in some ways worse. Nathan found it at dawn. When he went to check the repaired barn wall, someone had been at the east pasture fence in the dark, cut the wire in 3 places, and driven the cattle out through the gap. Not a stampede, not a panic, a deliberate, methodical operation that required someone who knew the property and knew how to move quietly through the dark without spooking a herd. He came back inside and told Elizabeth with the flat voice he used when he was controlling something that wanted to come out differently. "How many?" she asked. 30, maybe 35 head. The rest stayed in the north pasture." "Can you find them before Thursday?" "Some of them. The ones that didn't go too far." He was already pulling on his second coat. "Eddie's going out the South Ridge. I'll take the creek line." "I'm coming with you." He looked at her. "You don't need to." "I can ride," she said. "You need eyes on the east slope. That's 3 directions, and there are 2 of us without me." A pause. Then, "Can you handle the gray?" "Yes." They rode out in the early cold, the 3 of them splitting at the bottom of the slope, and Elizabeth took the east with her breath making small clouds in the air, and the gray mare moving steady beneath her. She had not ridden seriously in 2 years, but it came back the way things came back when they were built into muscle rather than mind. Automatic physical, the body remembering what the mind had been too preoccupied to think about. She found 11 cattle in a draw about a mile east, bunched together and unhappy but uninjured, and she spent an hour and a half working them back toward the property line. She was not skilled at this. It was Nathan's work, the particular language between a rider and cattle, and she knew she was doing it clumsily. But she did it. The cattle moved and she followed, and eventually they were back through the repaired gap and into the north pasture, and she latched the gate behind them. Nathan was already back when she returned. He had found 14 more. Eddie came in an hour later with 6. 31 recovered. 3 or 4 still out somewhere in the mountain probably. Likely not recoverable before Thursday. Nathan stood in the yard after Eddie reported and did not say anything for a moment. "He's trying to make sure you spend today and tomorrow chasing cattle instead of preparing for the meeting," Elizabeth said. "I know what he's doing, so we don't do it," she said. "We have 31 back. The others will come in or they won't. We get cleaned up and we go to Reeves and we finish preparing." Nathan turned and looked at her. He had been up since before dawn, and he had ridden hard for 4 hours in the cold. And he looked exhausted in a way he rarely let show the particular tiredness that came not just from physical effort, but from being ground against again and again by something that would not stop. She looked back at him steadily. "He's not going to stop," she said. "Between now and Thursday morning there will be something else, and we handle it and we go anyway, every time." "Elizabeth." "That's what we decided," she said. "Thursday." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once the small, decisive nod she had come to understand meant he had finished deliberating. "Thursday," he said. They spent Wednesday afternoon with Reeves in the ranch house, going through the sequence one final time. Reeves had organized the documents into a presentation that moved logically from the federal filing to the commissioner's confirmation to Eddie's testimony to the pattern of Whitmore's meetings in Harrow Creek over 4 years. He had also, he told them, received word from 2 other families in the valley who had agreed to attend the meeting and speak to their own experiences with Whitmore's pressure tactics. "How many people will be in that room?" Elizabeth asked. "Thursday Deacon's meetings run 30 to 50, Reeves said. "All the major property owners attend some of their wives. Garrett will be there. Price, Halloran." "Whitmore?" Nathan asked. "I don't know. He may come. He may send his solicitor." Reeves paused. "If he comes himself, that's actually better for us. It means he's not as certain of his position as he wants to appear." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "I want to speak first," she said. Both men looked at her. "Before the documents, before Eddie, before Reeves presents the legal case," she said, "I want to speak." "Elizabeth," Nathan said, "Reeves is the one with the legal authority." "I know that," she said. "And Reeves will be the most important voice in that room for the legal case. But the legal case isn't the problem. The problem is 3 years of a story this town has been telling about you. You can't counter a story with a document. You counter a story with another story." She paused. "Let me speak first. Then Reeves with the law. Then Eddie with what he saw. In that order." Reeves looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Elizabeth. "What are you going to say?" he asked. "The truth," she said. "All of it, in whatever order makes the room hear it." He held her gaze. She did not look away. She had been not looking away from things for 6 weeks now, and she had found it got easier each time. Not easy, but easier. "All right," he said. Reeves nodded. "Then we're ready." Wednesday night was quiet. No riders, no smoke, no sound from the perimeter. Elizabeth lay in her bed and listened to the mountain, and found to her own surprise that she was not afraid. She was something else, keyed up, sharply awake, the way she felt before a difficult accounting task, when she knew the numbers were not going to be friendly, but also knew she was going to find them anyway. Focused, clear. She thought about what she was going to say. She had not written it down. She thought writing it down would make it performative in a way she did not want. She wanted it to be what it actually was, the truth in the order it needed to come out, said by a woman who had been silent for 2 years and had found on a mountain in Montana that the silence had not protected her from anything. It had only made her smaller. She was done being smaller. She got up at 5 and made coffee, and when Nathan came in from checking the barn, she had breakfast on the table. They ate in quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of the last 6 weeks, a different kind. The taut, focused quiet of 2 people who know they are walking toward something and are collecting themselves for it. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready?" she said. He looked at her. "Elizabeth, I need you to know something before we go in there." She waited. "Whatever happens today," he said, "whatever they say or don't say, whatever Whitmore does, I need you to know that I would not have gotten here without you. The letter to the commissioner, the water rights document, the way you talked to those women outside the general store." He paused. "You came to this mountain as a stranger, and you understood what this place needed before I did." She looked at him across the breakfast table. "You gave me a room," she said quietly. "You slept on the floor so I could feel safe. You didn't ask me for anything. She paused. You showed me it was possible to be in the same space as someone and not be afraid. That's not a small thing, Nathan. That's not something I'm going to forget. He was quiet for a moment. We're going to be all right, he said, not a question. Yes, she said. We are. They rode into Harrow Creek at 9:30. Reeves was waiting at the hotel with Eddie, and the four of them walked together to the church hall, where the deacons' meetings were held. Elizabeth could feel the town around them, eyes through windows. Conversations pausing, as they passed the specific quality of a small community that knows something is about to happen and is waiting to see what shape it takes. The hall was already more than half full when they arrived. She counted quickly 40, maybe 45 people seated in rows of wooden chairs with a clear aisle down the middle and a raised platform at the front, where Garrett stood with his deacon's ledger, looking like a man who had been expecting rain and was calculating exactly how wet he was about to get. The families she did not know, the ones Reeves had spoken to, the ones with their own stories about Whitmore, were seated on the left side. She recognized Brant Hollis in the second row, his hat in his hands, watching the door with an expression of resolve. The Peregrine Sachs she had met at the ranch was there with an older man she assumed was his father. Whitmore was there. He was in the third row on the right side, and he was not what she had imagined. She had imagined someone physically imposing, loud, the kind of man who filled a room with presence. He was none of those things. He was medium height, well-dressed, with the sort of face that was designed to seem reasonable, the face of a man who had built his entire operation on appearing to be the sensible one in every conversation. He watched them come in with steady eyes, and something that might have been amusement, which told her he was either genuinely unconcerned or performing unconcern very well. Beside him was a man she assumed was his solicitor, younger, dressed in city clothes with a leather case on his lap and the watchful expression of someone paid to keep track of what other people said. Elizabeth walked to the front of the room and turned around and faced the room. She had not asked permission to speak. She did not look at Garrett. She looked at the room, at 45 people who had come here for a deacon's meeting and were about to get something else entirely, and she spoke. My name is Elizabeth Cole, she said. I've been on Black Pine Ridge for 7 weeks. Most of you know who I married. Most of you have an opinion about that. I'd like to take a few minutes before this meeting begins to tell you some things, and I'd ask you to hear me out. The room was very quiet. Garrett opened his mouth and she looked at him directly, and he closed it again. She turned back to the room. I came to Montana from St. Louis, she said. I came because I had nothing left where I was. Not money, not reputation, not safety. A man I trusted took all of those things from me and then told everyone who asked that I was the one responsible for losing them. She paused. I know what it is to have a story told about you that isn't true. I know how it feels to walk into a room and see people's faces change when they recognize your name. I know that the story doesn't need to be true to be powerful. It just needs to be told often enough. She let that sit for a moment. I've spent 7 weeks learning who Nathan Cole actually is, she said. Not the story, the man. And what I can tell you from 7 weeks of living on the same property, eating at the same table, working on the same accounts, dealing with the same threats, is that the man you've been describing for 3 years is not the man I know. Halloran, the saloon owner, made a sound from the third row that was not quite a protest, but was pointed in that direction. She looked at him. The night of the storm 3 years ago, she said. Nathan Cole sent a rider to this town for help. That rider, who is in this room, and who you all know, went to 3 men and told them what was happening on Black Pine Ridge. She paused. All 3 of them chose not to come. The room shifted. She felt it, the particular collective intake of a group that has been told something it was not expecting. That's, Garrett started. Eddie Hale is in this room, Elizabeth said, not raising her voice. He was the rider. He was 20 years old, and he rode down a mountain in a blizzard to ask for help. He can tell you himself what happened when he asked. She looked at Eddie standing at the back of the room. Eddie? Eddie stepped forward. His face was pale and set, and she could see how much it cost him, 20 years old when it happened, 23 now, and carrying 3 years of what he'd stayed silent about. But he stepped forward and he told it. Plainly, clearly, without decoration. The three men he'd gone to. What each of them said. What Halloran had said. Coles got what's coming to him, in a voice loud enough that Halloran's face went through several rapid changes. Halloran started to speak, and Nathan said from where he was standing at the side of the room, "Let him finish." It was not loud, but it was absolute. Halloran stopped. Eddie finished. He was done in 4 minutes. When he stepped back, the room was very different than it had been when he stepped forward. Garrett's jaw was working. Mrs. Price in the 4th row had her hands clasped in her lap so tightly her knuckles had changed color. Elizabeth waited 1 beat. Then she said, "Mr. Reeves?" Reeves came forward with his case and laid out the legal situation in the methodical way he had been trained for the water rights, filing the commissioner's letter, the structure of Whitmore's strategy, and why it had no legal foundation. He was precise, and he was thorough, and he did not editorialize which was the right choice. The documents spoke without embellishment. When he showed the 1861 water rights filing a copy, the original safe in his hotel case, she heard the murmur that moved through the room. Not just the left side, the right side too. Several people who she understood to be aligned with Whitmore's interest heard what the filing meant for Whitmore's strategy and turned to look at him. Whitmore had not moved. His face had not changed. His solicitor was writing rapidly. "The spring on Black Pine Ridge cannot be privatized by any individual landowner," Reeves said clearly. "This is a registered federal filing. It is not subject to territorial discretion. If Mr. Whitmore pursues any legal action based on water rights to that spring, he will be doing so in direct contradiction of a federal registration that has been confirmed by the Territorial Commissioner's Office." He closed his case. Then he said something Elizabeth had not known he was going to say. "I have also," Reeves said, "filed an inquiry with the Federal Land Office in Washington regarding 6 property transactions in this valley over the past 4 years. I have reason to believe these transactions involved irregular survey claims and potentially fraudulent boundary representations. The Federal Land Office has indicated they will be sending an investigator within 30 days. The left side of the room did not react visibly. They already knew. The right side of the room reacted considerably. Whitmore's solicitor stopped writing, and then Whitmore himself spoke for the first time. "Mr. Cole," he said, addressing Nathan directly, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of a man who practiced smoothness the way other men practiced marksmanship. "This is a considerable amount of preparation for a simple business negotiation." "This isn't a negotiation," Nathan said. "Everything is a negotiation." Whitmore smiled. It was a convincing smile. "You're a businessman. You understand that sometimes the cost of holding something is higher than the price of releasing it. I've offered you more than fair market value." "You burned my barn," Nathan said. The room went still. "I beg your pardon," Whitmore said. "Wednesday night, someone drove my cattle out through cut fences and destroyed a season's worth of feed." Nathan's voice was even, completely even, which was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "The week before that, someone set fire to the east wall. I don't have proof it was your men, but I've been in this valley for 9 years, and the only person who's given me a reason to expect that kind of attention is you." Whitmore's smile did not waver. "That's a serious accusation without—" "It's an observation," Nathan said. "I'm not in court. I'm in a church hall. I'm telling this room what has happened on my property in the last 2 weeks." He stepped forward, and the room shifted the way rooms shift when a large man moves with deliberate calm in a small space. "I've been on that mountain for 9 years, Nathan said. "I've run my operation honestly. I've never taken anything that wasn't mine. I've never threatened anyone. I've never driven anyone's cattle out in the dark." He paused. "The story this town has told about me for 3 years has cost me things I can't get back. It has cost me the ability to ask for help. It has cost me the willingness to trust this community that I have lived beside for 9 years. And I allowed it to cost me those things because I was grieving and I was alone, and I believed on some level that I had deserved it." The silence in the room was total. "I don't believe that anymore," Nathan said. My wife showed me why I don't need to believe that anymore. Thomas Reeves has shown me the legal position I should have understood years ago, and Eddie Hale has shown this room what actually happened the night the town decided what it thought of me." He looked around the room, deliberately making eye contact, not hurrying it. "I'm not asking for anything from any of you. I don't want apologies. I don't want gestures. What I want is for the story to stop. Because the story is wrong, and you all know it's wrong now, and every day you keep telling it you're making a choice." He stopped. He stepped back. Elizabeth had not taken her eyes off the room while Nathan spoke. She had been watching faces, the slow change happening in real time across 45 people who had come here expecting a deacon's meeting and were now being asked to do something considerably harder than sign a minutes ledger. She watched Garrett's face go from defensive to something more complicated. She watched Mrs. Hale, who had come to her outside the general store with concern in her eyes that was genuine, if misaimed, press her lips together and look at her own lap. She watched Brant Hollis on the left side exhale with the deliberateness of a man who had been holding his breath. She watched Whitmore. He was still smooth, still composed. But there was something working behind the composed face, now a calculation happening at speed, reassessing, looking for angles. She had seen that calculation before. She had seen it on Gerald Marsh's face when the business started going wrong, and he had started looking for the cleanest way out. She knew what that calculation meant. It meant he was deciding who to sacrifice. And then he did it. "Garrett," Whitmore said, turning to the deacon, "you've known me for 4 years. You know I came into this valley in good faith to do legitimate business. Whatever irregularities have been alleged by this lawyer." He gestured at Reeves with a practiced, diminishing motion. "Whatever accusations these people are making, you know my intentions were sound." Garrett stared at him. And what Elizabeth saw happen on Garrett's face in the following 3 seconds was one of the most illuminating things she had seen in her adult life. She saw a man realize in real time that he was being used as a shield. That the call to his witness was not a request for loyalty, but a bid to implicate him, because if Garrett confirmed good faith, Garrett's own name went alongside Whitmore's in whatever came next. Garrett, to his credit, was not stupid. "I've known you to attend meetings at my deacon's hall," Garrett said slowly. "I've known you to make representations about business in this valley. I've known those representations to be convincing." He paused. "I did not know about the water rights filing." "Garrett. And I did not know," Garrett said louder now, "that you had met with Halloran a month before the storm that killed Nathan Cole's wife and brother." He said it looking directly at Whitmore. His voice had the quality of a man burning something down carefully, deliberately, because it needed to burn. The room erupted. Not chaos, not quite, but 45 people's collective restraint breaking its banks in the form of overlapping voices, and the physical movement of people turning to each other, and the solicitor closing his leather case with a snap that was very loud in the sudden noise. Whitmore stood up. "This proceeding is irregular," he said, his voice sharpening under the smoothness for the first time. "These are unsupported allegations, and I will not—" "Mr. Whitmore?" Reeves spoke quietly, but the quality of his voice, the particular professional quiet of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, cut through the noise. "The Federal Land Office inquiry is already filed. The Commissioner's confirmation is already registered. Whatever you intend to do in the next 30 seconds will be done in front of 45 witnesses." He paused. "I suggest you sit down." Whitmore looked at Reeves. He looked at the room. He looked at Nathan, who was standing at the side with the flat, steady face that gave nothing away and everything away simultaneously. He sat down. The solicitor leaned close to him and said something quickly and quietly. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Elizabeth let the room settle for a moment. Then she said clearly enough to be heard, "Are there any other property owners present who have received communication from Mr. Whitmore or his associates regarding land or water rights in this valley?" 7 hands went up. Not all from the left side. 3 of them were from people who had been sitting on the right. Whitmore looked at those 3 hands, and something crossed his face that was not quite fear, but was the cousin of it, the specific expression of a man who has been playing a game that has suddenly revealed itself to contain more players than he knew about. Reeves opened his case again and took out a stack of papers. "I have testimony affidavits from 4 of those families," he said. "If the other 3 are willing to provide written accounts of their interactions with Mr. Whitmore, I would be grateful. The federal investigator will want them." The next 2 hours were not orderly. They were not supposed to be orderly. They were 45 people working through something that had been hidden for years, finding the shape of it now that it was in the light, and that process was not clean or quiet. People interrupted each other. People contradicted each other. Halloran tried to defend himself and was interrupted by a woman in the back row whose family's water access had been threatened the previous winter and who turned out to have a great deal to say on the subject. Garrett at some point stopped trying to run the meeting and started listening instead, which was perhaps the most useful thing he had done in 3 years. Nathan stood at the side of the room through most of it. Not speaking, not inserting himself, just present, a witness to what was happening, to the slow and imperfect but genuine process of a community revising the story it had told. Elizabeth moved when she needed to. She spoke when she needed to. When the conversation turned technical, to the water rights, to the property surveys, to the specific language of Reeves's filings. She came in with precision and clarity and then stepped back. She was not trying to run the room. She was trying to help the room find what was true. It was around noon, 2 hours in, when Whitmore made his last move. He stood up, interrupting a conversation between Reeves and one of the families from the right side, and he said in a voice stripped of its smoothness, now showing something underneath that was more honest, if not more admirable. "I came to this valley to make a legitimate investment. The regulatory environment around water access in this territory is genuinely unclear, and I engaged attorneys to help me navigate it." "You engaged attorneys to exploit it," Reeves said. "There's a difference. I made business decisions based on legal advice. Mr. Whitmore." Elizabeth spoke quietly, but the room heard it. 6 families, 4 years. Pressure tactics, irregular survey claims, and a barn fire. She held his gaze. "That's not a legal gray area. That's a pattern." His eyes moved to her. She saw it happen, the slight recalibration of someone assessing her for the first time as a genuine obstacle rather than a peripheral detail. "Mrs. Cole," he said with a version of the smile. "You've only been here 7 weeks. There's a great deal of context you may not fully—" "I was a bookkeeper for 12 years, she said. "I know what a ledger that doesn't add up looks like. And I know what it means when the same man's name appears in the margin of every transaction that doesn't add up." She paused. "Your name is in every margin, Mr. Whitmore." The smile went away. What was left was just the face underneath, thinner, harder, less certain than it had been 2 hours ago. He sat down. He did not speak again. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Whitmore and his solicitor were gone. They left without ceremony, without the formal departure of a man who had made his points and was satisfied with the result. They left the way people leave, when they have concluded that staying is worse than going quickly, with the solicitor's leather case tucked under his arm, and Whitmore's face showing nothing to the room that he did not have to show. The room watched them go. Then in the quiet that followed, something happened that Elizabeth had not expected and could not have scripted. Garrett stood up. He stood at the front of his own hall with his deacon's ledger in his hand, and he looked at Nathan across the room, and he said in the flat, direct way of a man who had decided that the minimum he owed was honesty. "Cole, I made a decision the night of the storm that I have not been comfortable with for 3 years. I told myself it was the road, the weather, that there was nothing to be done." He paused. "I know that isn't entirely true. And I know that what I did afterward, what we all did spreading that story, was easier than sitting with the fact that we had made a choice and people died." He stopped again. His jaw worked. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I wanted to say it plainly." The room was very quiet. Nathan looked at Garrett for a long moment. "I hear you," he said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution. Not the neat resolution that erased 3 years of damage with a sentence. Just, I hear you." Which was honest, and which was Elizabeth understood exactly the right thing to say. Garrett nodded once, sat down, and then Brant Hollis from the second row said, "What do we do about the cattle?" Nathan looked at him. "Your cattle that are still out," Hollis said. "3 or 4 head, you said. I've got hands who know the east slope. We can help look tomorrow." There was a brief pause. "I'd appreciate that," Nathan said. And it was that, not the legal victory, not Whitmore's departure, not Garrett's statement. It was that sentence, that small and practical offer, and the equally small and practical acceptance of it, that broke something open in Elizabeth's chest. She stood at the front of the hall and watched Nathan Cole stand in a room that had decided what to think about him for 3 years, and she watched him accept help from a neighbor, simply, without drama, without the stunned and cautious disbelief she might have expected, and she understood that he had already begun to believe in the weeks just past that this was possible, that community was possible, that the mountain was not meant to be a place of solitary punishment. She had helped him believe that, and he had helped her believe something in return. She thought about the corner of the bedroom, the wallpaper under her fingers, the one word she had said into the dark on the first night. She looked at Nathan across the room. He found her eyes at the same moment as if he had known she was looking. He held her gaze for one long moment with the expression she had come to know, the stripped-down one, the one without performance, and something passed between them that did not need words and did not get them. She turned back to the room and began to help Reeves collect the signed affidavits. Outside, by the time they were done, and the hall was emptying, the afternoon light was long and gold over the mountains. Elizabeth came out with Reeves's papers organized under her arm and stood for a moment in the air. Nathan came up beside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You were—" He stopped, started again. "What you did in there, what you said, I couldn't have done that without you." "You did plenty," she said. "Elizabeth." His voice was quiet and direct, the way it was when he meant something precisely. "I'm trying to tell you something." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that open, stripped expression, and in the late afternoon light on the street in front of the church hall in Harrow Creek, he said, "I know we came into this as an arrangement. I know that's what we both said it was, and what we both needed it to be." "Nathan, I need to say this," he said, "because I've been not saying it for long enough that it started to feel dishonest." He paused. "I don't know what it was when you arrived, but I know what it is now, and I think you know too." She looked at him for a moment. The papers were under her arm. The afternoon light was gold. Somewhere down the street a horse was tied up in front of the saloon, and from inside came the sound of ordinary life resuming its ordinary shape. "I know," she said. He reached over and took the papers from under her arm, so she didn't have to carry them, and they walked back to where the horses were tied, and neither of them said anything more about it, because nothing more needed to be said. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one she had ridden down in 7 weeks ago. That one had been the quiet of 2 strangers calculating the distance between themselves. This one was the quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and were still there side by side, moving toward the same place. At the top of the slope where the trail leveled out before the final stretch to the cabin, Nathan pulled up his horse. She pulled up beside him. They sat for a moment, looking out at the valley below, at Harrow Creek, reduced to a small cluster of rooftops, and smoke in the distance, at the mountains around them, at the sky going pink and amber at the edges. "Reeves thinks Whitmore will be gone by the end of the week," Nathan said. "Probably," she said. "And the federal investigator comes in 30 days. Give or take. So it's over," he said. She thought about that. "The fight is over," she said. "What comes next isn't." He looked at her. "What comes next is the ordinary thing," she said. "Cattle and accounts and fixing the barn properly and writing to the federal investigator and all the 1,000 things that have to happen every day to keep 300 acres running." "That sounds like a long list," he said. "It is," she said. "You're going to need someone to keep track of it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The same thing that had happened weeks ago, that first time, the almost smile that she had been cataloging ever since. "I know someone who's good at that," he said. "You do," she agreed. He clicked his horse forward, and she followed, and they came down the final stretch to the cabin in the last of the afternoon light. And when they stopped and she dismounted, she felt the mountain around her, the cold, clean air of it, the pines and the stone and the specific quality of silence that was only found this high up. And she felt it as something that belonged to her, not just where she was from. Nathan unsaddled his horse, and she unsaddled hers, and they put them in the repaired barn, and he checked the east wall the way he always checked it now, running his hand along the new timber. "Holds good," he said. "Hollis's men did good work," she said. They did. They walked back to the cabin. At the door, Nathan pushed it open and stepped aside for her the way he always did, and she went inside, and the warmth of the banked fire hit her, and the cabin received her in the way it always did. Now not like a foreign place, not like someone else's home, like hers. She turned around. He was in the doorway, looking at her with the open expression. "Thank you," he said, "for today." "We did it together," she said. "Elizabeth." He came inside and closed the door. "I know what it cost you, standing up in that room, saying what you said about your own life in front of all those people when you've spent 2 years not saying it." She looked at him. "It cost less than I thought it would," she said honestly. I think it cost less because I wasn't just saying it for myself. I was saying it because it was true, and because you deserved to have the truth told." He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and put his hand along her jaw carefully, gently, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. Nothing taken, nothing assumed, just offered. A question made physical. She leaned into his hand. He kissed her. Once briefly, with the restraint of a man who was not taking anything he was not sure was being given. She put her hand over his, holding it there. "I'm sure," she said quietly. "Before you ask, I'm sure." He exhaled a long, slow breath, like something he'd been holding for a very long time. "All right," he said. She looked up at him. "All right." Outside, the mountain held its silence and its cold and its deep, enduring patience. And inside the cabin on Black Pine Ridge, two people who had been told the wrong stories about themselves stood together in the warmth of a fire they had both helped build, and chose each other. Not out of arrangement, not out of necessity, out of everything that had happened between a bedroom door in a church hall and a hand on a table in the dark, and the long, slow learning of what it meant to be known by someone and not be afraid of what they saw. Charles Whitmore left Harrow Creek on a Friday morning. Elizabeth heard about it from Brant Hollis, who came up the mountain with his 2 hands to help find the remaining cattle, and mentioned it the way men in this valley mention things, sideways, without ceremony, as if the information were incidental to the actual purpose of the conversation. "Checked out of the hotel yesterday evening," Hollis said, pulling on his gloves in the yard. "Him and the solicitor both. Took the early coach east." Nathan was cinching a saddle and did not turn around. "Anyone see them go?" "Half the town," Hollis said. Nobody waved. That was all that was said about it. They found the remaining cattle by mid-morning, 4 head that had wandered into a shallow ravine on the northeast slope, and were annoyed about it, but unharmed. Hollis's hands knew the terrain, and the work went quickly, and by noon they were eating Elizabeth's cooking at the table in the cabin, and the conversation had moved entirely to cattle prices and the condition of the south pasture fence, which apparently had been a point of discussion in this valley for longer than Elizabeth had been alive. She listened and said little, and understood that this ordinary, practical, slightly argumentative conversation about fence lines at a table full of men eating her biscuits was something Nathan had not had in 3 years. Not the company of men who respected him. Not the ordinary texture of belonging to a community, even imperfectly, even with all the complicated history that sat underneath it. She watched him at the head of the table and saw him relax in increments, the way he always relaxed, slowly, as if he had to give himself permission for each degree of it. When the men left, he stood in the yard and watched them go, and then came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway. "They'll be back Tuesday," he said. "I heard," she said. She was washing dishes. "Hollis wants to look at the East Pasture water situation." "He's practical about it," Nathan said. "It's not sentiment. He knows his downstream water is safer if my operation is stable." "I know," Elizabeth said. "That doesn't make him wrong to be practical, and it doesn't mean it can't be both things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Both things. Practical and something more than practical," she said. "People can have more than one reason for doing something." He looked at her. She could feel him looking at her from the doorway, that steady, attentive way of his that she had stopped being startled by somewhere in the last 8 weeks. "Yes," he said. "They can." She handed him a dish to dry without looking at him, and he took it, and they finished the dishes together in the comfortable silence, and that was the end of the day that Charles Whitmore left Harrow Creek. The federal investigator arrived 3 weeks later. His name was Alderman Pratt, and he came from the land office in Helena with 2 assistants and a methodical approach to everything that Elizabeth found immediately reassuring. He was a small man, dry-voiced with the manner of someone who had spent 20 years examining documents and had concluded that documents were more reliable than people and conducted himself accordingly. He set up his operation in the hotel in Harrow Creek and began requesting interviews. He interviewed Nathan twice. He interviewed Reeves. He interviewed Eddie. He interviewed Brant Hollis and the Peregrine Sachs family, and 4 of the other families who had signed affidavits. He interviewed Garrett and Price, and eventually Halloran. He also asked to interview Elizabeth. She went down the mountain on a Tuesday morning and sat across from Alderman Pratt in a hotel room that smelled like pipe tobacco and paper, and she answered his questions for 2 hours. About the water rights filing. About the commissioner's letter. About the document organization that had led to finding the 1861 filing in the first place. Pratt listened with the focused silence of someone who asked questions as tools, not conversation. At the end of 2 hours, he set down his pen and looked at her over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "the 1861 filing. You found it in an unsorted document collection." "In a locked box that hadn't been properly organized," she said. "The filing had been inserted between 2 pages of a survey document. It could have been missed for another 20 years. Most people would have missed it," he said. "I was looking for something specific," she said. "When you know what you're looking for, things that would otherwise be invisible become visible." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the deliberate absence of one, a man who found something worth acknowledging but had trained himself out of showing it. "You were a bookkeeper," he said. "I was. In St. Louis." "Yes." He tapped his pen against the desk once. "The irregularities in Whitmore's transactions go back further than 4 years," he said. "There are survey claims in 2 other territories that appear to follow the same pattern." He paused. "The water rights angle, the specific approach of identifying communal resources and attempting to establish individual control, is the same in all 3 cases." Elizabeth looked at him. "This isn't the first time he's done this." "No," Pratt said. "It is, however, the first time the legal mechanism was identified and documented before the acquisition was completed." He looked at her steadily. "That is not a small thing, Mrs. Cole." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It isn't." She rode back up the mountain with Pratt's words sitting with her the first time the legal mechanism was identified before the acquisition was completed. She turned that over in her mind, the way she turned numbers over when they were yielding something, looking at it from different angles. Whitmore had done this before, in other territories, with other families who had not found the thread in time. She thought about those families, the ones she would never know in places she had never been, who had lost land or water rights or both, because no one had sat down with a box of unsorted documents and known what to look for. She thought about what it meant to know what to look for. The years of training, her father's patience with ledgers and survey records, and the particular discipline of ordered thinking. Everything she had learned at his table and then spent 2 years believing had been destroyed, along with everything else Gerald Marsh had taken. It had not been destroyed. It had been waiting. When she got back to the cabin, Nathan was at the table with the accounts she had updated the previous week, going over figures with the focused attention of a man who had learned to trust numbers because the woman who organized them had shown him that numbers told true stories if you let them. He looked up when she came in. "How is Pratt?" he said. "Thorough," she said. She took off her coat. "Whitmore has done this before. Other territories, same pattern." Nathan set down his pencil. And this is the first time it was stopped before completion." She hung up her coat and turned around. "Because of the document. Because we found it." He looked at her. "Because you found it," he said. "We found it," she said firmly. "I stayed up until 2 in the morning, and you brought me coffee and put a blanket on my shoulders and gave me access to every document you had. That's not me alone." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "All right, we found it." "Yes," she said. "We did." She sat down across from him at the table. Outside, the afternoon light was coming through the west window at its late autumn angle, lower and longer than it had been when she arrived. The quality of it changed by the season, in ways she was only beginning to learn to read. She had been here long enough now to see the light change. That seemed significant in a way she couldn't precisely articulate. "Pratt will finish his investigation by the end of the month," she said. "He'll recommend federal charges. He told me that off the record, though I don't think he intended it to be entirely off the record. I think he wanted me to know." "Whitmore knows it's coming," Nathan said. "He left because he knew." "Running doesn't help him if the investigation is federal," Elizabeth said. "Reeves said his assets can be frozen pending the investigation." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "It's done then. The legal part." "The legal part," she agreed. He looked at her across the table. "And the other part?" She met his eyes. "What other part?" "The part where we figure out what this is," he said. His voice was even and direct, the way it was when he was being precise about something important. "What we are." She looked at him for a moment. 8 weeks. 8 weeks of coffee in the morning, and accounts at the table, and late-night conversations by the fire, and a hand held in the dark, and a kiss that had been brief and careful, and had opened something that had not closed again afterward. 8 weeks of two people learning each other with the patience that neither of them had known they possessed until they needed to. "I think we both know what this is," she said. "I think we do," he said. "I'd like to say it plainly anyway." She waited. "I love you," he said. Simple, direct. No preamble, no construction around it. Just the words in his flat, honest voice. I don't know exactly when that became true. I think it was gradual enough that I didn't notice it happening until it was already done. He paused. "I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm saying it because it's true, and I've spent enough of my life not saying true things because I was afraid of what happened after." Elizabeth looked at him across the table. The accounts between them, the autumn light on the wall behind him, the man who had slept on the floor of his own cabin, so she could feel safe, and she felt the last of the distance she had been maintaining close over. Not because it had collapsed, because she had chosen to let it go. "I love you," she said. "I've known it for about 3 weeks, and I've been deciding whether to say it." "What made you decide?" "You brought me coffee at 2 in the morning and put a blanket on my shoulders and didn't ask why I was still awake," she said. "And then you were there in the morning and you didn't make it into anything. You just let it be what it was." She paused. "I've never had anyone do that before. Let things be what they are without requiring them to be something more convenient." He was quiet for a moment. "You deserve that," he said. "As a baseline, not as something remarkable." "I know that now," she said. "I didn't before I got here." He reached across the table, and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that for a moment in the afternoon light, with the accounts between them and the mountain around them, and the particular quality of silence that was their silence, the one they had built together over 8 weeks of careful and deliberate choosing. The investigation concluded in November. Pratt's report went to the Federal Land Office, and from there to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in Helena. And by the end of the month, Charles Whitmore had been formally charged with fraud survey manipulation and attempted extortion across 3 territories. His assets were frozen. His solicitor, the one who had sat in the church hall writing rapidly in his leather case, had apparently provided a great deal of useful information to the investigators in exchange for considerations that were not made public. Reeves wrote to Nathan with the news. Nathan read the letter at breakfast and set it down and pushed it across the table to Elizabeth without comment. She read it. She set it down. "How do you feel?" she said. He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to anything worth asking. "Like it's over," he said finally. "Not the way the end of something dramatic feels, the way the end of something long feels. Like putting down something you've been carrying so long you forgot you were carrying it." She nodded. She understood that feeling precisely. "What does it feel like to put it down?" she asked. He looked at her. "Light," he said. "It feels like it probably should have felt all along." She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the document box. Not in the locked section in the front where ordinary correspondence went. Filed and finished. November brought the first real snow. Not the dusting they had seen in October, but actual winter arriving without apology. The kind of snow Nathan had described with that flat voice when he told her about the storm, the kind that changed the quality of everything on the mountain. The cabin held it well. Nathan had been preparing since September, the way a man prepares for something he has learned to respect. Absolutely supplies wood. Everything that needed to be inside was inside before the first heavy night. Elizabeth watched the first real snow from the kitchen window with her coffee, and felt it as something different than she expected. Not dread. Not the abstract anxiety of being snowbound in a remote place. Something closer to readiness. The mountain under snow was the mountain at its most honest, stripped of everything that softened it. And she had learned enough of this place in 4 months to meet it without flinching. Nathan came in from the barn and saw her at the window. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking about the first night, arriving in this weather, what it would have felt like." "Terrifying," he said. "You knew." "I knew you were frightened," he said. "I didn't know exactly what of, but I knew the ride up the mountain in the dark to a stranger's house was not. I knew it wasn't nothing." She looked at him. "You never said." "There wasn't anything useful I could say," he said. "I could just try to make it as small as possible, the thing you were afraid of." He paused. "I don't know if I succeeded." "You slept on the floor," she said. "That wasn't a strategy," he said. "It was just—" He stopped. "It was just the right thing to do." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and put her hand on his chest, feeling the steady, reliable weight of him. "It worked," she said. "Whatever it was. It worked." He put his hand over hers. They stood like that for a moment with the snow coming down outside and the fire going and the cabin around them holding everything it had come to hold. It was in December that the letter came from St. Louis. Elizabeth recognized the handwriting before she had fully registered the return address, and her hand went still on the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The handwriting belonged to her mother's sister, her Aunt Clara, the only family member who had maintained contact after Gerald Marsh's systematic dismantling of the Carter family's reputation. Clara had written twice in the 2 years since Elizabeth left St. Louis, careful letters that said little but established that the connection remained. This letter said more. It said that Gerald Marsh had been arrested in September. Fraud charges related to a business investment scheme that had collapsed and left 17 investors without their money. It said that in the course of the investigation, the history of what he had done to the Carter family business had come out documented this time with actual evidence because one of the 17 investors had hired an investigator who had been thorough. It said that people in St. Louis who had believed the story Gerald told were now in possession of a different story and that the new story was considerably more accurate. It said, "I thought you would want to know. I thought you deserved to know. I hope Montana is everything you needed it to be." Elizabeth sat at the table with the letter in her hands for a long time. Nathan came in from outside, read her face immediately, the way he always read her face, and sat down across from her without speaking. She handed him the letter. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I thought when I imagined this happening, I thought I would feel relieved, or vindicated, or—" She stopped. "Mostly I feel tired. For the people who lost money. For the time that was wasted." She paused. "And something else. Something I don't have a precise word for." "Finished," Nathan said. She looked at him, "When something has been open for a long time and it closes," he said. "Not dramatic, just closed, done. The account balanced." She exhaled. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." He reached across the table. She took his hand. "Your father knew what he built," Nathan said. "He built it in you, not in the business in you. That's why you could find a water rights filing in a box of unsorted documents at 2 in the morning. That's why you knew what to look for." He paused. "Gerald Marsh couldn't take that. Whatever else he took, he couldn't take that." Elizabeth looked at their joined hands on the table. She thought about her father at his desk, patient, precise, teaching her the discipline of ordered thought. She thought about the ledgers she had learned to read before she learned to cook. She thought about everything she had believed was lost, and everything she had discovered on a mountain in Montana was not. "No," she said quietly. "He couldn't." She wrote back to Clara in January. A long letter, longer than any she had written in 2 years, longer perhaps than anything she had sent since before her father died. She wrote about Nathan. She wrote about the ranch and the water rights and Whitmore and Pratt and the deacons' meeting and the barn fire and the particular texture of winter at altitude. She wrote about what it meant to have come to Montana with nothing and found somehow everything she had needed and had not known how to ask for. She did not write "I am happy." That word felt too simple and too large simultaneously. She wrote, "I am well and I am home and I am not afraid." Clara wrote back in February and said that she was glad and that she would like very much to visit in the spring if that was possible. Elizabeth showed the letter to Nathan. He read it. He looked up. "Your aunt wants to visit." "In the spring," Elizabeth said, "if that's possible." He considered this with his usual thoroughness. "The east bedroom," he said. "I'll need to fix the window before spring." Elizabeth looked at him. "You don't have to." "It's been needing fixing since last summer," he said. "I've been putting it off." He handed the letter back. "Tell her spring is fine." She wrote to Clara that night at the kitchen table, while Nathan read his book by the fire, and the ordinary domesticity of it settled around her like something she had not known she was missing, and was now not missing anymore. Spring came to Black Pine Ridge the way spring came to mountains, reluctantly, in stages with setbacks. There were days in March that felt like deep winter, and then days in April that felt like the world was making up for lost time, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes to reveal the pale, tentative green underneath. Elizabeth stood at the door of the cabin one morning in early April and smelled the change, the particular smell of mountain spring, cold and alive, the smell of something returning that had been absent for months, and she felt it as a promise being kept. Nathan came up behind her. "The south pasture's clear enough to move the cattle down next week," he said. "Good," she said. "Hollis's men are coming Tuesday, aren't they? And the Sachs boy. He wants to learn the east fence line before summer." He paused. "I told him I'd show him." She glanced back at him. "You're teaching him." "He's a good worker," Nathan said. "He just doesn't know this land yet." She looked back at the slope. The mountain was turning green at its edges, and the sky was the particular blue of high-altitude spring. And below them at the bottom of the slope, where the road wound toward Harrow Creek, she could just make out the first movement of what might have been a rider coming up. "Clara arrives Thursday," she said. "I know." He had fixed the east bedroom window in February as promised. He had also, without being asked, acquired a proper mirror and a small dresser for the room items that had required a specific trip to a supplier in the next town over, that he had not mentioned until the items appeared. "Nathan," she had said when she saw them. "The room needed a mirror," he had said. "And a proper dresser." It didn't have either. She had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had kissed him in the way she had been kissing him for 4 months now. Not the brief, careful first kiss, but something that had grown into itself over time, easy and certain and mutual. He had tolerated this for a moment, and then kissed her back in the way he did everything thoroughly without rushing. Clara arrived on a Thursday afternoon on a stage from Billings, a woman in her early 50s, with Elizabeth's coloring and her father's directness and eyes that evaluated everything quickly and without disguise. She stepped down from the coach and looked at the mountains around her, and then at Nathan, who had come down with Elizabeth to meet her, and she looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the steady face. "Mr. Cole," Clara said. "Ma'am," Nathan said. He reached for her trunk. Clara watched him pick it up and carry it to the wagon with the easy efficiency of a man who handled heavy things without thinking about it. Then she looked at Elizabeth. "Well," she said. "Well," Elizabeth said. "He's very large," Clara said, not quietly. "I'm aware," Elizabeth said. "And he just—" Clara gestured at the trunk in the wagon. "Without asking." "He does things like that," Elizabeth said. Clara looked at her niece for a moment, with the particular attention of a woman who had been worried about something for a long time and was now reassessing. "You look different," Clara said. "I've been outdoors a great deal," Elizabeth said. "That's not what I mean." Elizabeth met her aunt's eyes. "I know what you mean." Clara looked at Nathan, who had returned and was waiting at the wagon with the patience he brought to all waiting. "Mr. Cole," Clara said, "my niece has written me a considerable number of words about you." "I expect so," Nathan said. "Do you know what she said?" "No, ma'am," he said. "But I'd guess she was honest about it." Clara studied him. "She was." "Then I hope it was satisfactory," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said you slept on the floor of your own cabin on your wedding night, so she would feel safe." Nathan did not react. He simply held her gaze. "She said you brought her coffee at 2 in the morning when she was working," Clara said. "She said you never asked for anything she wasn't ready to give. She said—" Clara's voice changed slightly, not breaking, but bending. "She said you showed her it was possible to be in the same space as someone and not be afraid." The street was quiet. A cart went by at the far end. Someone went into the general store an ordinary Thursday in Harrow Creek. "That's something she deserved to know a long time before she got to Montana," Nathan said. His voice was even and direct. "I'm glad she knows it now." Clara looked at him for another long moment. Then she nodded, once the decisive nod of a woman who had made a determination. "Well," she said, "let's go see this mountain." The week Clara spent on Black Pine Ridge was the loudest week the cabin had contained in the entire time Elizabeth had been there. Clara had opinions about everything: the account organization, which she examined and pronounced excellent; the garden plot on the south side of the cabin, which she examined and pronounced an opportunity; the east bedroom window repair, which she examined and pronounced acceptable. She had long conversations with Nathan in the evenings that Elizabeth listened to from the kitchen, with something warm moving around in her chest, watching the man who had been alone on a mountain for 3 years talk to a woman who had been her father's favorite sister, and finding that they got along with the comfortable ease of two people who valued directness and wasted no words. On the third evening, Clara found Elizabeth at the window watching the last of the light leave the mountains. "Elizabeth," she said. "I know," Elizabeth said. You're going to say something about my father," Elizabeth said. "About how he would feel about this. About whether—" "I was going to say," Clara said, "that you look like yourself. For the first time since before he died, you look like the person you were before all of it. Before Gerald, before the business, before the grief." She paused. "You look like his daughter." Elizabeth pressed her lips together. "He would have liked him," Clara said. "Nathan. He would have your father would have taken one look at those accounts, and one look at that man, and he would have shaken his hand and said, "Good job." Elizabeth laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, sudden and undignified, the kind she had not produced in years. "Good job," she said. That's what he would have said. "He was not a demonstrative man," Clara said fondly. "No," Elizabeth said. "He wasn't." They were quiet for a moment together, the two of them, in the way of women who share grief and have learned to carry it without being crushed by it. "Thank you for coming," Elizabeth said. "Thank you for letting me," Clara said. Clara left on a Sunday with her trunk and her opinions, and a list of suggested improvements to the south garden that she had written out in a precise hand, and left on the kitchen table, along with a note that said simply, "I'll come again in October if the roads are passable. C." Nathan picked up the note and read it. "She's coming back in October," he said. "She is," Elizabeth said. "The east bedroom will need a rug," he said. Elizabeth looked at him. "The floor's cold in October," he said with complete practicality. She kissed him, and he made the sound he made when she did things like that without warning. A small sound surprised and then not surprised, something that had become familiar and that she intended to keep making happen. Summer arrived on Black Pine Ridge with a fullness that Elizabeth had not been prepared for. She had been here in late summer, in fall, in winter, in spring's reluctant beginning. But full summer was different. The mountain in summer was alive in a way that was almost loud. The green of it deep and various, the air carrying the specific quality of altitude and sun that she was already dreading the loss of when fall returned. She was not dreading fall itself. She was dreading the loss of this specific thing. That distinction she thought was important. She had lived for 2 years in the dread of everything returning. Now she lived in something else, the ordinary human grief of good things passing, which was entirely different because it did not undercut the good thing. It ran alongside it. She told Nathan this one evening in July, sitting outside the cabin in the last of the summer light, and he listened with his full attention the way he listened to everything. "That's the difference," he said, "between surviving and living. When you're surviving, you're afraid of losing everything because you're already near the bottom. When you're living, you know what you have," she said. "Yes," he said. "So you can grieve the passing of it without believing the passing destroys it." She looked at him. "When did you figure that out?" "About 3 months ago," he said. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat in the evening light and watched the mountain darken and the first stars come out over the pine ridge, and said nothing for a long time, because nothing needed to be said. Later, when the dark was full and the fire was built back up inside, she thought about the stagecoach from St. Louis. The 11 days of rattling wheels and dust, and the sentence she had repeated to herself like a catechism, "You made a choice, now you live with it." She had made a choice. She was living with it. That sentence had been a bracing, a steeling, a preparation for something she believed would require endurance. She had not imagined that living with it might mean this. The accounts on the table, the coffee at 2 in the morning, the sound of a man's voice in the dark that she had stopped being frightened by and started listening to. The east bedroom that was hers, and the kitchen that was hers, and the 300 acres of mountain that were hers, in the only way that mattered, the way where you know a place by its seasons, where you know what the light means, and what the silence means, and what it means when the cattle are restless before a storm. She thought about what she would have told herself on that stagecoach if she could have. She would not have told herself that it would be easy. It had not been easy. She would not have told herself not to be afraid. The fear had been real, and the fear had been reasonable, and the fear had served her in specific ways. She would have told herself the man at the end of the road is going to sleep on the floor so you can feel safe, and it's going to be all right from there. Nathan was already asleep when she finally came to bed. Not the bedroll by the fire, not the settee, but beside her, the ordinary place. The place that had taken months to become ordinary and was now simply where he was. He slept with the same stillness he brought to everything. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. Outside the mountain held its summer silence, deep and layered and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out in the valley below. The pines on the ridge moved in a wind she couldn't hear from inside. The stars were very bright at this elevation. Elizabeth Carter. Elizabeth Cole lay on Black Pine Ridge in Montana and felt the particular quality of a life that had found its shape. Not a perfect shape. Not a shape without seams or history or the visible repairs of things that had been broken and mended, but a shape that was hers, built from her own hands and her own mind and her own patient choosing alongside a man who had chosen the same. She had come to this mountain with $43 and a letter and a fear so deep it lived in her body before it lived in her mind. She had found on this mountain what she had not known she was looking for. Not rescue, not protection, not someone to make the fear go away. She had found someone who made room for the fear and waited on the other side of it. That was everything. That had always been everything. In the morning, she would get up before him and put the coffee on, and he would come in from the barn, and they would eat breakfast at the table with the accounts nearby and the mountain outside the window, and the day's work already taking shape in both their minds, and it would be ordinary, and the ordinary was the whole point. The ordinary was what they had fought for, and what they had built, and what they would keep building season by season, year by year, on a mountain that had once been a place of grief, and was now without qualification, without exception, without any shadow of the stories that had once tried to define it. Home.